And welcome back, fellow football fanatics, to another College Football with Sam show. Today we will be talking about win totals, top 5 questions in the Big Ten. We will also be discussing some SEC and Big Ten breakout teams, and talking about more things as well. So welcome in. Thank you for joining. Let me know how you're doing today in the comments section below. And also, if you have anything you want me to answer to or say during the show, as we have our segments planned out, we're going to go through those, bang them out one by one. But if you have anything that is really on your mind that you want me to respond to, send it in the chat. And if you want to make sure that I have time to get to it and talk about it for a few seconds or a few minutes, make sure to leave a super chat with it. Make sure also to like the show, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell. That way you can get notified when we go live Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at noon Eastern time. And yeah, just do all those things before we begin. And thank you for tuning in. It's pretty incredible this season when you look at the win totals, when you look at the schedules. You know, when I look around college football, I think that Oregon, Texas, Indiana, Ohio State, Georgia, that those are your top 5. Notre Dame I have in there at 6, so that would be your top 6 right there. We'll be talking about my top 10, as I've actually made some pretty serious changes to the top 10. Haven't had time to make serious changes to the whole top 25 yet. But those, I think, are your top 6, clearly. And then probably Texas Tech, Miami, maybe like LSU, Oklahoma, USC, Michigan. That would be your next 6, probably. I mean, maybe even Iowa if we can figure out what they have at quarterback. There's just a lot of good things around the sport, a lot of good teams. We have a lot of parity at the top. And what I love is how the toughest schedules have been aligned with the best teams. So on Twitter, I was just engaging with people that were mad at me for a variety of things, but one of them was picking Indiana, I think, to go undefeated, but then picking Ohio State to go 10-2. And I'm thinking, guys, if you're Ohio State, your win total's lower than Indiana or Oregon. You should be happy that I'm picking Ohio State to go over their win total, which I am, by the way. That's something I changed, and that's because Ohio State, Georgia, and Indiana are the top 3 staffs in America. I know Indiana's is 1. I have not decided where Ohio State and Georgia fall, and maybe there's one staff that is better assistants than Ohio State and Georgia, so maybe that results in them having a better roster. But you got to place weight on coordinators and head coaches, since they game plan the most, they call the plays, and I think Ohio State and Georgia and Indiana have that top 3 pretty locked in there. If Oregon did some things differently, if Texas did some things differently, if Notre Dame did, maybe one of them could have broken out. Michigan's pretty close, I would say, too. Michigan would probably be top 5, but not quite at the Ohio State, Georgia level, especially because of the head coach position. And they were telling me, like, hey, Indiana's not going to go 13-0 again. And that is a bold prediction I have. I'm not going to pretend that it isn't bold. More likely than not, Indiana's probably going to go 11-1 or even 10-2. It's going to be really hard to go undefeated, but we saw a lot of undefeated teams last year, and I think that was due to a variety of reasons. You're going to see more again this year because Texas Tech and Notre Dame have win totals at 11.5, and no one had an 11.5 win total last year. You're going to see some undefeated teams this year. There's a chance that, Oregon, Ohio State are just so good in the Big Ten that no one can really scale with them, and then maybe they go undefeated. I know that would be bold to say of Indiana because the talent composite, but Indiana's only going to get more talented, and they brought most of their staff back, lost their strength and conditioning staff, but Cignetti's former strength and conditioning coach at a prior program is now at Indiana, so I kind of trust them there. The top 3 Big Ten programs, Texas, Georgia, so the top 2 in the SEC, there is a chance that they are so good because a lot of those teams return a lot or tried to bring in a lot through the portal or have reloaded previously, where outside of Texas Tech and Notre Dame, who more likely than not are going to go 11-1 or 12-0, at least 1, 2, or maybe even 3 of those programs, with what they're bringing back, with what they have on their roster already, could create scaling issues for everyone they play and just run through them until they have to play each other. And not all of those teams play each other. So it's created a lot of conversation where Ohio State and Penn State have the same win total, but Ohio State would beat Penn State by 4 touchdowns this year. The schedule for Penn State is just the easiest in the Big Ten. Ohio State probably has the toughest schedule nationally. And the Twitter conversations were so interesting because people are making these confident assumptions already. Like this one commenter was like, oh, you're insane for thinking Indiana's going to beat Ohio State again. There was this other commenter that was mad at me for not picking Michigan to win 10 games. Or there are some Indiana fans that think that they're going to beat everyone by 50. The only fan base in the Big Ten I've encountered so far that hasn't said anything wildly ridiculous about their team's ceiling is probably Oregon. And that's because Oregon has the highest expectations, combined with probably the most painful end to the year last year, where in a rematch they lost by 34 points. So it's a fun time, an interesting time in college football for sure. It's a great time too. I love engaging with all of you on Twitter. I like disagreeing with you. I like agreeing with you all. Let's talk about these win totals here, and first and foremost, look at the Big Ten win totals. They were released last week. Pate talked about them last night because Pate is a partner with FanDuel. I think he kind of got an inside scoop the day or two before. That's why he was able to quickly drop those very impressive graphics on Twitter that they looked so clean, was so awesome. I love his Twitter graphics. Love his Twitter graphics. And we're going to give you, I think, some equivalent or better graphics here looking at these Big Ten and SEC win totals. FanDuel releases win totals for the Big Ten and for all of college football in this 2026 season. Let's check out the Big Ten win totals here. So for the Big Ten, you have 18 teams. And what strikes me when looking at these win totals here is how wildly different the schedules are and how you have to factor in strength of schedule with the performance or expected performance of this team and their roster talent and their development and their coaching. And that is how you get the win total that is on the left side of your screen here. For example, Penn State and Ohio State both are at 9.5 in these Big Ten win totals, but they're not the same team. They're not even close, guys. If Ohio State and Penn State played this year, even if it were in Beaver Stadium, I would expect Ohio State to do to Penn State exactly what they did last year in the Horseshoe. The exact same thing, the exact same result. I don't care that Penn State has a new staff and brought in a lot of veteran production. I also wouldn't care that Ohio State lost pretty much all of their best players outside of Jeremiah Smith and Julian Sayin. Don't care, because Ohio State has a better staff. They are much more talented. And Penn State, while they bring in good production and probably have a better coach than they did last year, they lose a lot of NFL production. They lost a lot of upside that they had last year roster-wise. So unless Campbell can definitely, in year one, develop remaining parts of the Penn State roster and the roster he brought in from mostly Iowa State but other programs to a level that is greater than what Penn State's roster was last year, I think the result would be the same. So a team that would beat another team by 21 or 28 points, and maybe more if you run into, scaling for the, bigger team just being able to really make it ugly and get out of hand with good matchups, what you would then have is, what am I even saying here? It's crazy that they're both at 9.5 in terms of their win totals. That's nuts right there. Both at 9.5. Indiana and Oregon at 10.5 is also intriguing, where you have a team in Oregon that has a national title or bust type expectations, along with probably Texas. Those are the two teams that I think have the best rosters in college football in terms of just alien talent combined with depth. They have the best combination there. They won the portal. They won retention. And then you have Indiana, who lost a lot and probably has a schedule that is as tough as Oregon's, and yet they're sitting there at 10.5. And I think that's very interesting as well. Why could that be? Well, I think that the books, as intelligent as they are, the same reason why they have Ohio State sitting at 9.5 due to the tough schedule, and it's juiced to the over, so they're telling you that 10-2 is more likely than 9-3. In the same way that they are giving Ohio State some benefit of the doubt to go 10-2 with that schedule, which is the toughest schedule in America, and they're giving Ohio State that benefit of the doubt because Day is an elite coach, and he has 2 NFL-level coordinators, and Larry Johnson, who I would say at this point probably is the best D-line coach in America, or at least very close to it, and other great staffers like James Laurinaitis, Carlos Loughlin, Tim Walton, Matt Guerrieri. Indiana has the exact same thing, except they just went 16-0 and won the national title with the 72nd best recruiting roster. So you could argue that if there is one staff that is definitively better than Ohio State's or Georgia's, it would probably reside in Bloomington. And they have an easier schedule. They also did a very good job in the portal, signing the number 1 portal class per On3, and they do retain some key players, especially on the lines of scrimmage, some at receiver. Why wouldn't you give Indiana benefit of the doubt in the same way that you do Ohio State, in the same way that you do with Georgia, and these other top programs that have top coaches, and Indiana staff is so good that they have broken through that glass ceiling that is the blue chip ratio. They have defied the blue chip ratio. And I think that Indiana staff is so good that that has more to do with Indiana and Curt Cignetti than it does with a new trend in college football. I think they are the exception to the rule, not that the sport in itself is actually changing all that dramatically, outside of what we've already seen in NIL and the shortening of the distance between the best Power 4 team and the worst Power 4 team. Sadly, the group of 5 has just totally collapsed thanks to NIL, becoming a feeder league for the power leagues. But that is why I believe Indiana and Oregon are up there sitting at that 10.5. They do not have the same toughness of schedule that Ohio State does. When you look at odds to win the title, Ohio State's comfortably ahead of Indiana and Oregon to win it all, and that's even with a win total at 9.5 that could suggest they'll miss the playoffs. So whether it's sharps or whether it's the sports books, there is a lot of hype, respect, admiration, and high expectation for the Hoosiers, Buckeyes, and Ducks. And I personally, and I think everyone should think this way until proven otherwise, think those are the top 3 programs in the Big Ten. They are the best teams and rosters in the Big Ten this year. And they're probably the top 3 programs in the Big Ten moving forward. They could be the top 3 programs in college football right now and moving forward, with the combination of scouting, recruiting, development, in-game coaching, and just resumes they've put together over the past several years. Moving on to teams that are solidly below 9.5, 10.5 win totals. These are teams that are definitely on the outside looking in from a preseason college football playoff contention standpoint. Those teams, I'm looking at Michigan, USC. I'm also looking at Iowa and Washington there. So Michigan and USC tied there at 8.5. What do I think about them? I think that they are definitely top 15 power rated teams preseason, possibly top 10. And the reason their win totals are this low and not 9.5 or even 10.5, which their win totals would be that high with different schedules, is they have some of the toughest schedules in college football. Ohio State's the toughest in the sport. I think Michigan's or Northwestern's is next. USC definitely has a top 10, if not top 5 schedule nationally. Both of those teams, USC and Michigan, have to play Indiana, Oregon, and Ohio State. Michigan also has to play Iowa, Penn State, and Oklahoma. And USC has a date with Washington, a road trip to Wisconsin in the middle of November before playing Ohio State, which is just a devious trap game. And they also have to play UCLA, whose win total at 5.5 suggests they're going to improve compared to where they were last year. The top of the Big Ten, minus Penn State, who I would argue is probably power rated at closer to an Iowa or Washington level than a Michigan or USC level, the top of the Big Ten is paired with some of the toughest schedules in the country, or at least hard schedules. You have to really distill down the 18-team list to the bottom of the conference before you get to some of the easier schedules in the nation. Again, outside of Penn State. Iowa, for example, they only play Michigan, Ohio State, and Washington. That's in the month of October, late September. And after that, outside of a non-con hosting of Iowa State, who's going over a total program reset, their next toughest games are Illinois, Nebraska, Wisconsin, Minnesota. They play Northwestern, I think. And it's a very manageable schedule, especially for them being at the top of the Big Ten, top half in terms of win totals, and last year they finished in the top third in terms of power ratings. Washington's schedule, probably a little bit tougher than Iowa's. They gotta, play Iowa, they gotta play USC, Oregon and Indiana, they get back-to-back at the end of the year. Illinois, I was a bit shocked by how high theirs was, given they lose so much. I guess that's faith in Brett Bielema's program. I gave them some of that benefit of the doubt by picking them to go bowling, even with what I think is a tough schedule, and how much they lost. They're going to be at the bottom of returning production lists, I think. So maybe it's also part of public perception, too. Before we close out this segment, just a few other ones I want to touch on. I'm not going to exactly touch on the 3.5s, Michigan State and Purdue. Those programs are just in a bad spot right now. They both play Notre Dame out of conference, which doesn't help. And unlike Wisconsin, who plays Notre Dame, but avoids Michigan, Indiana, Oregon, and Ohio State, and they get USC at home, they get Penn State on the road, but we don't know how good Penn State is yet. Just playing Notre Dame out of conference and then a Big Ten schedule is not going to do you any favors. And Michigan State and Purdue also have very bad rosters from what I can tell. Maryland and Rutgers, similar. Northwestern has a good roster. They just play Oregon, Indiana, and Ohio State all on the road, while also having to play Penn State and Iowa and Illinois. So half of their schedule, if not more, are teams that have 7.5 or greater win totals, and the top 3 teams in the conference on the road. Their roster's good. Trust me from a preseason research standpoint. Their schedule's just as tough as nails. For Nebraska and Wisconsin, 2 programs that made what many viewed as great hires or outstanding hires in some cases in the 2023 preseason. They haven't exactly gone all that well. Rules has gone better than Fickle's, but Rule has also faced easier schedules, dramatically easier schedules. They both enter this season with 6.5 win totals. And I think this is a do-or-die year for both of them, in a sense, especially Fickle, just given how people can't process how, a worse record with a harder schedule is basically the same record as the team you're comparing them to. So Nebraska and Wisconsin have really been the same team or close to it over the past 3 seasons. Wisconsin's just had probably worse injury luck and tougher schedules. I don't think either, unless they completely collapse, are in danger of being fired, but there's a chance that they could totally collapse with either the roster they have not being complete or the schedule they have in the case of Nebraska just being so tough. Nebraska right now has the schedule that Wisconsin has been dealing with for the past 2 years. Wisconsin currently has the schedule that Nebraska's been dealing with over the past 2 years. So I'm curious to see how that dynamic works as the 2 programs are currently trying to move forward. But the schedule toughness they've been dealing with for the past 2 falls is now flipping between those 2. UCLA, this is one where I'm not even going to dive into the other win total picks. We're just talking about them and my logic behind them. UCLA is going to win more than 5.5. I'm going to make a segment later in the year sometime talking about my favorite, best bets, I could say, even though I don't bet and I don't advise you to, but at least as kind of a fun way to pick, okay, which team is going to go over? Which team do I think is obviously going to supersede their win total? I will tell you right now, I think that's UCLA. Indiana, Oregon, and Ohio State, same thing with Penn State, Michigan, USC, are accurately priced, very accurately priced. There are right sides to bet from a value standpoint, but we're not getting into that. This is just talking about the win total. UCLA, with that staff and with how much they brought in, and with their schedule really only having a road trip to Oregon and Michigan as the top teams they play, they avoid Indiana, they avoid Ohio State, they avoid Penn State, they play USC at home at the end of the year, they do not play Iowa, so they avoid them. They have a very workable schedule, a great staff turnaround, an excellent roster. I just think the logo and public perception and how bad they were last year will probably hold people back. Also, they don't have a big fan base, so you're not going to get a lot of action from their fans there. But I believe strongly that UCLA is at least going to go bowling next year, and the schedule works out to where if everything hits, they could compete for the college football playoff, because that is a very workable schedule. Those are the 2026 Big Ten win totals for all 18 teams. It's very fascinating. I think they're very accurately priced. Don't be deceived by the differences in schedule into thinking that Penn State and Ohio State are the exact same quality of team. They are not. Because of the new super leagues, because of how college football works now, and because divisions are gone, so schedules vary more year to year than ever before, you have to be careful about translating win total to power rating. It's not that exact anymore. Moving on to the SEC win totals. FanDuel releases 2026 SEC win totals. And no SEC team, unlike the ACC, the Big 12, the Big 10, or Notre Dame, who has one of the easiest schedules I've ever seen, the SEC does not have a team with a 10.5 win total. They lack there. Now, on one hand, you could argue this is because the toughness of the league, and I think there is something to be said about that. The SEC is obviously better than the ACC plus Notre Dame, which is where Notre Dame gets its schedule from in large part, is close to half ACC. They have a required amount, I think it's 4 required ACC games per year, but usually they go out of their way to schedule other ACC opponents, like I think Miami. Maybe they were one of the required games last year. They also played Stanford, Boston College, Pitt. They played NC State, Miami. It maybe Stanford is the game that isn't required, but because it's a rivalry, they play it anyway. I don't know. But it's about half ACC. They've scheduled some lower tier Big Ten teams in the past. Don't know if that was intentional or not. But the SEC league is definitely tougher than the ACC or Big 12. We know that. I will argue, and maybe this will make some SEC people mad, that the Big Ten is as tough of a league as the SEC, if not maybe for the first time better. I think last year it was very close. I don't care about bowl records for context because of opt-outs and different motivational factors. There's too much to be able to measure in the postseason due to different things. But last year, the Big Ten definitely had the superior top-end teams. The year before that, because of how good Ohio State was, that was true. In 2023, because of Michigan and Ohio State, it was true. But the SEC could always say their middle or lower tier was better. Now, I don't know if you can say that this year, outside of maybe the really bottom tier. Even last year, you could say that a little bit. I think what's really going on here is that Texas is the only roster with an SEC or Big Ten caliber schedule outside of Penn State and Wisconsin, who have more ACC or Big 12-esque schedules, that has a roster full of impact players, full of aliens. I actually love Georgia's roster quite a bit. I felt like I was too harsh on them in recent episodes, got some pushback from Georgia people I trust, and much like how earlier this year I got some pushback from Ohio State people I trust about picking them to go 9-3 or thinking that their roster had some holes, I'm higher on Ohio State and Georgia now than I was, say, in January or February when I saw what they were losing, what they did in the portal. A bit higher on them now. But what I will say about Georgia in particular is Georgia is a very deep roster. It's probably a top 3 roster in terms of depth. They do not have the amount of X factor players, at least ones that I think are obvious and proven, that a lot of these other top programs do. They don't have a Cam Coleman or Ryan Wingo at receiver. Gunnar Stockton has a very high floor, but does he have the ceiling of an Arch Manning, a Dante Moore, a Julian Sayin, even a Bryce Underwood, who isn't as good as Stockton right now, but does he have that ceiling? Georgia, their O-line and team overall was young last year. It's much older this year. Losing a player like C.J. Allen at linebacker and Christian Miller at D-tackle hurts. Can Raylan Wilson and Elijah Griffin step up and, replace them, reload those positions? Can the defensive end group, which returns production but wasn't super good last year, they were good but not great, they weren't Georgia standard, can they improve? I would give them benefit of the doubt there, personally. So I will tell you right now, just like I did UCLA for the Big Ten segment, a lot of the top Big Ten programs are accurately priced, very accurately priced, to the point where I would stay away from them, even if I am picking one of them to go decently over or under their win total. I will tell you right now for Georgia, Georgia will go over. Their coaching is too good. They're too deep. They're too solid. Their style of play will own 11 out of 12 teams they play on a schedule that is one of the easier ones in the SEC and the Big Ten. And look, receiver is a concern for them, but Georgia in 2024, and that's the worst this receiver room will be. It's not even guaranteed to be that bad. With that receiver room, they went 10-2 with a much tougher schedule and a team that probably will face more injuries than this team did and didn't have the right fit at quarterback like this team does. So I think they're going over pretty confidently that 9.5 line, but that is why it's at 9.5. They don't have a Jeremiah Smith. They don't have a Sonny Styles. They don't have a quarterback with as high of a ceiling as Arch Manning or maybe even Keelan Russell or a lot of teams in the Big Ten. I'm not even saying that's my opinion because I have Stockton as a top 5 quarterback preseason, but that's the consensus opinion of people that make these lines. So, ergo, because they don't have a lot of those aliens at specific positions, Georgia's aliens are at linebacker, they're KJ Bolden at safety, and those positions aren't viewed as high value as some of the other ones I mentioned, you're not going to get that 10.5 win total, which means if you strongly believe Georgia's going over that, you're getting a discount there. Texas is at 9.5 because they play Ohio State in the non-con and then have a tough schedule that features Texas A&M, LSU, Oklahoma, Ole Miss, Florida, and Tennessee, all programs that have 7.5 or higher win totals. And then Missouri, Texas also plays Missouri, and Missouri is only at 6.5 because their schedule's a pain in the butt. So that's fascinating right there. We could talk about just the SEC's win totals and how few of them are at 9.5 or higher all day long. Whether it's due to depth, all of them playing, Power 4 opponents in the non-conference at least once, the fact that there is some doubt surrounding the conference due to the past 3 years and their performance in the postseason. I will tell you, once again for the final time, Georgia is winning more than 9 games. They, I think, are very similar to Ohio State this year. They just do not have the schedule that Ohio State does. Ohio State's schedule is far and away, I think, outside of a few teams, the toughest in America. Georgia has probably a schedule that is one of the tougher ones in America, but more like a top 3rd Power 4 schedule, not the number 1 or number 2 Power 4 schedule. Alabama at 8.5, Texas A&M at 8.5, LSU at 8.5. I think those are perfect. With LSU, they're bringing in a lot in the portal. They will be more experienced than A&M or Alabama. Their schedule is probably as workable as both of those. There is, I think, the skepticism of prior year's results. How quickly will that portal class mesh together? It is a program reset. A&M and Alabama are coming off college football playoff appearances. Just looking at the rosters, I do think LSU is better than both A&M and Alabama right now. I currently project them to beat both of those teams, but I think they're accurately priced, given the talent on each roster, the coaching staff on each roster, the fact that their schedules look A&M will have a tougher schedule than they did last year, but the defense should be better. LSU's schedule will probably be similar to last year's. Alabama's definitively easier. I think Alabama as a team quality, at least at the start of the year, is going to be much worse than they were last year, but the schedule's easier, and that should allow DeBoer and Ryan Grubb and Kane Womack to build this team's confidence and stature and strength up so that they're much better in October when they start to really face a tougher part of their schedule. Ole Miss, Florida, and Tennessee and Oklahoma, almost forgot about the Sooners, at 7.5. These are intriguing because I can argue, at least for Oklahoma, that maybe it should be at 8.5. And you could probably argue that with all of these teams except for maybe Florida, given where Florida finished last year and the fact that it's a program reset. They're in year one again. Ole Miss returns possibly the best running back in America in Kawan Lacey, possibly the best college quarterback in Trinidad Chambliss. Oklahoma has a defensive savant as their head coach, and they return the entire offense and aced the transfer portal. Florida returns a loaded lines of scrimmage, and Billy Napier did a good job building the roster. At least an okay job, I would say. Great job at recruiting. Don't know about the development or strength and conditioning there. But the foundation's there, and it's good. Summerall comes in, and he was viewed as an ace coach by his peers in the G5. Tennessee is kind of undergoing a program reset from a coaching and philosophical standpoint, but they have the building blocks and a workable schedule and a high-ceiling quarterback and a high-ceiling recruiting class that they're bringing in. All of these teams are entertaining. I'm personally higher on a few of them than others. I'm probably higher on all of them collectively than most people are, and lower on some teams below them in win total. So let's talk about those teams before we get on out of here. South Carolina at 6.5, they're definitely going under. So for the Big Ten, I gave one team who's definitely landing on one side of their win total or not, in my opinion. I will do a video where I talk about more teams that I'm confident in will sway one way or another. For the SEC, it'll just be these two. Georgia to go over 9.5, South Carolina to go under. Beamer has lost the program. He has lost, maybe not the roster right now, but he will. He does not have the required coaching acumen and the required knowledge of how to build a roster. Not saying I could do better, but when you look at how he's recruited and some of the star talent he has, to lose the way they did last year and to just look the way they have in many of his years there, and to be that up and down indicates someone who is not SEC caliber. So I think he's done after the year. Vanderbilt, Missouri, and Auburn are at 6.5, and then Kentucky, Arkansas, and Mississippi State are at 4.5. And I think that tracks. In the Big Ten, we just talked about Michigan State and Purdue, who have 3.5 win totals. Those two would have the worst rosters in the SEC by quite a bit. I think Arkansas, Mississippi State, and Kentucky have more talented rosters than those two Big Ten teams specifically, and probably more so than Rutgers or Maryland, although they have some star players Purdue and Michigan State don't have. Those are the 2026 SEC win totals. Let me know what you think about those. And again, looks like a race between Texas and Georgia for the top of the conference. Very confident that Kirby Smart and Georgia will go over that 9.5 win total given how their schedule and roster align. Also confident that South Carolina will underachieve relative to their 6.5 win total. Now that those are out of the way, I want to finish up what we were planning to talk about in the last show on Friday. So Big Ten and SEC win totals are just done. They're out of the way. I now want to discuss the biggest questions in the Big Ten, talk about some breakout candidates, and then talk about some other team-specific topics. And also, Kirby Smart, Ryan Day, Curt Cignetti. That's your top three. I don't think there's really any argument for any coach to be in there. Maybe if you project into the future, there is. But if you're just looking at what they're doing now, what they have done before, and you factor like how they're managing things right now, and their staff hires and so on and so forth, I think those are clearly the top three. Clearly. And I think that for me especially, it's fascinating to say that because I'm not a fan of either of those programs. So I'm looking at them Some could argue I actually should be biased against Ohio State because I'm a Michigan fan, but even to a lesser degree against Indiana because they're Big Ten competition. But no, those teams have the three best head coaches right now, and I think that is by quite a big margin. But we'll talk about those later. Again, if any of you have anything to say, or if you just want to support the channel, feel free to send me a super chat, or if you just want to support the channel, click the link in the description to go to my Patreon page and sign up as a paid member, because I get a larger share of the cut from Patreon, from the money you pay, than I get from YouTube when you send a super chat. Biggest questions in the Big Ten. What are the biggest questions in the Big Ten this fall? Are we going to look at 5 massive dart? I messed that up. Sorry. I have scripts for this and I just misread. I misread the script there. A little bit of a college football with Sam bloop or college football with Sam, systematic error, if you want to laugh at that. What are the biggest questions in the Big Ten this fall? We are going to look at 5 massive darts, and we're going to throw them and project them and see where they land on the board to determine. I messed it up again. I don't know what's going on. What are the biggest questions in the Big Ten this fall? We are going to look at 5 massive darts that will determine, depending on where they land on the dartboard, who wins the Big Ten, who wins the national title, whether or not a team or many teams, plural, in the Big Ten go undefeated, and who's going to rise, who's going to fall, who can compete with the top of the Big Ten, who's close. We're going to start with Oregon. We have to start with Oregon. And the reason we have to start with Oregon here is the idea that Oregon, while not the favorite to win the Big Ten, they're actually behind Ohio State and Indiana in odds right now, which, as I've said in prior videos, I kind of think is crazy. And I sort of think that way because Oregon's roster last year was top 5 nationally. It was probably the 3rd best behind Ohio State and Indiana. They were the 3rd best team. At least I would say a top 5, top 4 roster could have been the 3rd best. And whereas Indiana and Ohio State lose a lot, same with Miami, same with some of these other teams at the top, like Ole Miss, who made that deep run, but they also return a lot. Oregon returns almost everything of value. Even though they lose 3 to 5 offensive line starters, the 2 tackles will probably be undrafted free agents. Pregnan will be a first-rounder, so that's a big loss. But they return almost everyone that matters. They return their most talented players. They didn't lose many talented players instead of backups on defense to the portal, and they're bringing in loaded recruiting class after loaded recruiting class. So question number 1 is, can Oregon maximize their talent? Because if they do, and this is why this is question number 1, if they totally maximize their roster talent, which means perfect development, perfect coaching, or close to that, I don't think anyone's beating them. And if someone does, it'll be in the regular season, and they will win the national championship. Just look at how crazy good this roster is. So you have Dante Moore, PFF grade of 90.2, completes 72% of his passes, 3,565 yards returning from last year, 3-to-1 TDI&T ratio, and he had to play Indiana twice. And Indiana has the best coordinator, I think, or one of the best coordinators in all of college football. He had to face D'Angelo Pons twice. 15th in QBR, was competing with Mendoza until that Peach Bowl for round 1, pick 1 in the 2026 NFL Draft. He will be competing for that again in 2027. DeCorian Moore was injured for much of the year, but still had 497 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns, 14.6 yards per catch. DeCorian Moore is an alien, and he will be a 1,000-yard receiver or very close to it this season with the Ducks. Jeremiah McClellan, 557 receiving yards, came on as the year went on, as different receivers got injured, also had 3 touchdowns, phenomenal player, redshirt sophomore, again, super talented player. Evan Stewart We'll get to him in a minute, but we have Iverson Hooks, who's transferring in from UAB. 82.3 PFF grade, 927 receiving yards, 7 touchdowns, 12.9 yards per reception. Hooks is a very underrated player, and I know he's coming from the lower level, but let me remind you of someone else who did, and who played very well at Oregon. Hez Johnson. Yeah, you get the picture. Evan Stewart in 2024 had 613 receiving yards, had a big game against Ohio State. Outside of really that game and another one was inconsistent, but I would expect with a full preseason being healthy that the man who had 5 receiving touchdowns and 613 receiving yards can bounce back in a major way this upcoming season. Defensively, you got Amari Washington, who had 22 pressures, 1.5 sacks, was viewed as a consensus first-round defensive tackle. He's coming back. And whereas Cade McDonald was the best D-tackle in all college football, I'm pretty close to saying that Amari Washington's going to be the best D-tackle in all of college football this year. 80 PFF grade last year, 4.5 tackles for loss. Bear Alexander, 6.5 tackles for loss, a sack, 18 pressures. Major breakout year last season. He can contend for being a first-round defensive tackle for the 2027 NFL Draft if he has a good fall campaign. Mateo Uyunglele was viewed preseason as a first-rounder. I think was kind of flirting with that for the 2026 draft, but fell off. So now the player with 52 pressures, 6 sacks, 2 forced fumbles, and an 82.4 PFF grade is coming back to solidify a first-round pick in 2027. Tatum Tuioti, 9.5 sacks, 38 pressures, their best run stop defensive end, and their best defensive end overall last year, their most impactful player. 83.8 PFF grade. I know people are probably going to criticize me for citing PFF so much. There are players where PFF just does a horrible job grading them. I found actually a lot of offensive linemen are inaccurately graded by PFF, and I think that makes sense because offensive line is a very hard position to grade people individually for. But I think they've done a good job grading a lot of Oregon's players, especially the defensive linemen. That was one of the best defensive lines in college football last year. It played a big role in why Oregon fielded the best defense of Dan Lanning's career with the Ducks thus far, and a defense that should be even better this upcoming season. Nasir Wyatt, technically like outside linebacker, D-end type, 92.7 PFF grade in limited action, 3 sacks, 7 pressures. He is probably their highest ceiling pass rusher. I can't wait to see what another year of development and putting on weight will do, especially since he was a true freshman last season. Brandon Finney Jr. at corner, freshman All-American, will be an All-American this year. 3 interceptions, 7 pass breakups, 2 forced fumbles, is quite possibly the most physical corner in all of college football. He's going to have another year with the Ducks in 2027 because he's just going to be a sophomore this year. He won't even be draft eligible. And you also got Coy Parrish from Maryland, who did not have a very good year last year, but was awesome as a true freshman with Minnesota in 2024. I think with a better supporting cast, better development, better coaching, and more talent surrounding him, he will get back to being at least an all Big Ten player, if not an All-American player. The only question for Oregon, and this relates directly to whether or not they can maximize their talent, is coaching. Dan Lanning, I think, is a top 5 coach in the sport, so I give him an A+. If you're a top 5 coach in the sport, pretty much I'll give you an A+ grade. Last year, they were, I would say, the 3rd best team in America. It was Indiana, Ohio State, and Oregon. That doesn't quite measure talent, because if we're talking about talent, Ohio State was 1 last year. You could even argue Oregon was ahead of Indiana in terms of, playable talent last year. But in terms of who was the best in final power ratings and final predictive metrics, it was Indiana, Ohio State, and Oregon. That was your top 3 consensus. And Ohio State and Indiana were pretty much unanimous top 2. But FEI had Oregon second in their final ratings. That's a credit to Oregon's staff, which last year with Dan Lanning, Will Stein, and Tosh Lupoy had one of the best head coach coordinator trios in all of college football. Now both coordinators, Will Stein and Tosh Lupoy, are head coaches at Kentucky and Cal. So how do Drew Mehringer and Chris Hampton do at their respective coordinator positions, that's going to be fascinating. If these coordinator hires pan out, Oregon will win the national title. I like the hiring of Chris Hampton because he's called the defense before and had success with it. Mehringer was an OC at Rutgers in the late 2010s. It's hard to judge him. That one I'm a bit more wait and see on. But Lanning overall is a head coach who is one of the best in America, a head coach that when I see it is going to win a national title at some point. And I can't help but think that why not this year? I know that books are pretty low on Oregon. They're 5th in title odds. I haven't seen anyone outside of, PFF, which is very analytical. They do a good job over there. Not perfect, but they're very analytical. And Joel Klatt rank them number 1. Now, I have 2, and Joel Klatt and PFF are huge names. I'm probably a medium-sized name. One day will be huge. But a lot of others outside of them don't like Oregon at 1, and I get this sense that the public doesn't buy into Oregon at number 1. I think Oregon clearly has the best roster in college football overall, not just in the Big Ten. So best in the Big Ten, best in college football. The question is just Dan Lanning and the coaching staff. If they can maximize the talent, if they can continue to learn from their wins and losses, from some of their struggles and some of their ups, then I have absolute confidence that Oregon is going to be one of the top teams in recent memory. Not just the best team this year, not just the national champion, but the talent they have, the skill they have, the explosiveness they have will be remembered for years to come if they can put everything together. That is how good of a team Oregon has. It's how good of a roster they have. It's Dan Lanning's best roster. It will be his best defense. It will be the offense that has the highest upside outside of maybe the 2023 offense. And Dan Lanning, just like Ryan Day did before he won a title, just like Kirby Smart did before he won a title, just like Curt Cignetti did before he won a title, continues to progress as a coach year over year over year. He continues to get better. Second biggest question, are Indiana's lines of scrimmage elite? It's the second biggest question because Indiana is the one team in college football, more so than even Ohio State or Georgia, who I would also not question their staffs, whose staff I'm not going to question. That was an awkward way of phrasing it. What I'm essentially saying is that Indiana's staff, I think, is in a tier of their own because of what they did last year and the year before. So I'm not going to question it. Ohio State's and Georgia's staffs I'm also not going to question, but I'm not going to give them the same, series of gold stars in, whatever way I'm going to grade them that I will Indiana, just because of the differences there, where Indiana has achieved more than Georgia over the past 2 years and achieved as much as Ohio State without having that same inherent, built-in talent that makes things easier. That's why coaches try to recruit at a high level. It makes their jobs easier. It helps them, it helps them coach to a higher degree because they can win more and, achieve at a higher level and therefore play and coach closer to their ceiling and achieve closer to their ceiling, if that makes sense. Indiana's coaching staff is basically maxed out. I know they're replacing a strength and conditioning coach, and maybe Cignetti really messes that up. But the idea that he, out of all coaches, is going to mess up a hire in the exact same way that like Ryan Day and Kirby Smart, they might make a questionable hire. They might make one that in the long term isn't elite, but they're not going to wet the bed. They're not going to make an awful hire. They have in the past, but that was a while ago. That was back in 2020 for Day and probably in the late 2010s for Kirby Smart. Ever since then, they've made anywhere from great to elite hires. I'm going to give the same benefit of the doubt to Kirby Smart there, or to Curt Cignetti there. Same with Kirby Smart, same as Day. That strength and conditioning hire is at least going to be great. It might be the best hire in America, somewhere in between there. With Indiana, it is all about the roster. That is the question for them. Last year, they were first in all of these advanced metrics. They did not have the NFL talent that Ohio State had in the two deep. Compared to every other two deep, they had equivalent or close or better talent then. And Indiana was able to go 16-0 and beat Oregon twice, beat Ohio State, beat Miami. They had some close wins along the way, but they finished as the best team and as the national champions because they had the best coaching staff, but they also had a pretty darn good roster that the coaching staff developed, assembled, put together. Now, losing a lot of those former James Madison players that Cignetti was able to develop and hold on to for 4 or 5, and in some cases 6 years, and bringing in a new class of transfers and facing probably the toughest schedule that he and Indiana have faced in his 3 years there, there's questions for Indiana. I mean, is their roster going to be good enough this year to beat a team that has definitively more talent, not just overall, as most teams in theory did, but in the playable two deep, and more talent when you factor in development and play on the field, whereas Indiana, by that metric, had one of the most talented rosters in all of college football. In the same way they were able to beat Ohio State last year, if Ohio State is the exact same team as last year, which would be very impressive by day, can Indiana beat that team? If Oregon is who I think they are, and who many people that know what they're talking about and who they're talking about are, can Indiana beat that team? Can they beat Georgia if Georgia has their best team since 2023 and has a bunch of NFL aliens everywhere? Can they beat a team like Texas, who in theory has those players? What about Notre Dame? Or are they just going to be maybe a bit better than 2024, but not better than that team enough to consistently beat teams that are above them in recruiting talent and can punch with them in a playable two deep sense? They were so damn good last year. 4th in success rate margin, 2nd in points per play margin, only behind Notre Dame there. Notre Dame had a radically easier schedule, especially since they didn't play the bowl game. And then 1st in yards per point, FPI, S&P+, FEI, PFF, efficiency, and game control. They weren't the most talented team last year. That was Ohio State, but they were the best team overall. If their lines of scrimmage are elite, I think they can be the best team overall again. It's only question 2 because if Oregon maximizes their talent in the same way that Indiana has over the past 2 years, then I just think Oregon will be just about too much for everyone. For Indiana, when you look at their offensive line, got Carter Smith, Drew Evans, Bray Lynch, Joe Brunner, and Adedemola Ajani. That's their projected left tackle through right tackle, and then the guards and center in between them, offensive line, starting. Carter Smith was viewed by some at points last year as a first-round tackle. Then Akeem Mesidor and Ruben Bain destroyed him, and now he'd probably be a day 3 pick, maybe at best day 2. If he can improve again, Bob Bostad is one of the more underrated O-line coaches in America. If they can make the jump they did from 2024 to 2025, make that same jump into 2026 as a unit, this could be the best offensive line in all of college football. They're all very experienced, have played multiple years outside of Ajani, who played in the later part of last year and was serviceable, better run blocker than pass blocker, as most, if not all, of the Indiana offensive line was last year. Drew Evans, Bray Lynch were both starting guards last year. Ajani played some at guard when they were a bit injured. Brunner was a starting guard at Wisconsin. Indiana's biggest problem last year on the O-line was that they were, in reality, 5 guards. It's also what Ohio State's problem on the offensive line was last year. It's 5 guards instead of 3 guards, 1 playing center and 2 true tackles. Indiana just had a better scheme than Ohio State did that helped their O-line, and they were much better at run blocking as independent players than Ohio State's players were, but both had pretty egregious struggles in pass blocking. We'll talk about Ohio State a bit later, but with Indiana, if they can improve in pass blocking, continue to be great in run blocking, and they should even make progress there with how much production they're returning, then I like this to possibly be the best O-line in college football. It has that ceiling, but you also have to clean up some things. And we've had a lot of down O-line play in college football, so I could really say that about any offensive line. For Indiana's projected starting D-line, end, we got Chidi Obiizor and Toby Onsunsanmi. At tackle, we have familiar faces in Tyreek Tucker and Mario Landino, who started last year. All, especially the D tackles, high PFF grades, did a great job getting to the quarterback. This D-line, just when you look at the size, the experience, the height, weight, they should be more talented this year and better than they were last year. But I'm also not going to discount how Stephen Daly and Kellen Wyatt and Michael Kamara were able to pan out, and how, the scouting hit there. Even some of the best staffs, even the best staffs in America, think of Alabama in 2016 when Barnett, or I think it was Blake Barnett, their quarterback, started at the beginning of the year, and then he completely flamed out. Even the best staffs have complete busts in evaluations because you're recruiting and developing so many players that, one is going to fall through the cracks, or you're going to miss one here or there. So there is a chance it also regresses with how much they change at DN, but factoring in Joe Agelli, backup D tackle projected, and projected backup DN Joshua Burnham, this should be Indiana's best defensive line under Curt Cignetti as well. I'm going to pay special attention to Carter Smith again. Over 1,000 total snaps last year, 2 sacks and 9 pressures allowed. Great run blocking grade, great pass blocking grade. If I were to criticize one thing here, I think PFF is probably way overrating his pass blocking grade. He's a good, maybe average, above average pass blocker, helped a lot by the scheme. Excellent run blocker, as Indiana's entire offensive line is. He probably will make another jump. Indiana, their players just keep getting better and better, especially the ones that return. We saw this last year. We saw this with Indiana players who were on Tom Allen's team that stayed with Cignetti, though few and far between, but Carter Smith was one of those. I expect there to be some improvement there, but I can't lock that in. Same with any player. If that is locked in, that Carter Smith actually becomes, say, tackle number 1 or tackle number 2 for the upcoming draft, and he's an excellent pass blocker, that unlocks an ability for Indiana to win it all or be an elite team in a different way than they were last year. And that would be utterly terrifying. On the other side, you have Tyreek Tucker, who out of high school wasn't even a ranked player. One of the last players that was at James Madison with Cignetti that is still with Indiana here. So definitely someone to look at as a, member of the cultural bedrock for the Hoosiers. 30 pressures, 6 sacks last year, 12 tackles for loss. Could be the best college defensive tackle in America. Probably wouldn't be the best NFL prospect, but maybe he will be. I mean, he was a projected day 3 or day 2 pick last year. Maybe with another insane year getting a little bit bigger and stronger and faster, you could see him jump up the board there. Something that Curt Cignetti and Indiana have taught me with their success is that really, with the right things in place, almost anything is possible. And that, I hope, is what they have taught you as well. Overall for Indiana, their offense is fantastic. It was the best offense in America last year. The defense, I would say, was the most consistent. Ohio State's was the most talented. Texas Tech's had the most annoying unit to deal with. Indiana's was the most consistent because they had a much tighter secondary than Tech, and their D-line was about as effective as Tech's. Didn't have the same upside, but had a higher floor. And with Ohio State, the only reason it was more consistent is they played a higher amount of big games, and in none of their big games did they have an issue with the offensive line that Ohio State's D-line had when they played Miami. They didn't get the same pressure on Beck than Ohio State did, but they did such a better job stopping the run and locking that up outside of really one long run, whereas Ohio State consistently allowed 5 and even in some cases 10-yard carries and allowed Beck to even be used as a, runner at different points. So that's a lot to replace there. You had the best offense by probably a mile last year. You had a defense that was up there with a generational one in Ohio State's from an efficiency standpoint, from a performance angle, one that was up there with Texas Tech's, which was possibly their best defense in school history. You fielded your best defense in school history, and your special teams were phenomenal. So you have to reload and maintain and replace all of that. That's very tough. But given the returning production that Indiana has, and also given the fact that we've talked about this, they have the best coordinator head coach trio in all of college football. Mike Shanahan, Bryant Haynes, Curt Cignetti. There are ones that are competing with them for that, but I think you have to give it to them right here and now. This group made Indiana the national champions at 16-0. They beat one of the more loaded rosters in the 2020s in Ohio State. They somehow beat that team. They beat an Oregon team that was a year removed from having possibly one of the best rosters in the 2020s as well. This Oregon team. They beat them twice, both by double digits. So I'm giving them absolute benefit of the doubt. The reason I'm asking this question this way is Indiana returns and has the most production from last year entering this year along the line of scrimmage. So that logically is going to be the area where they're most likely to improve, if they improve anywhere, is the offensive line and the defensive line. With how their schedule lines up, instead of getting Ohio State on the road, they get them at home, and that's a pretty big swing there given how good Ohio State is. And Michigan's on the road, but Michigan just isn't Ohio State now. Maybe in the future they could be. Maybe with the talent they have, they could try to match them this year, but I can't pick that yet. I can't give Michigan that benefit of the doubt quite yet. If they have elite lines of scrimmage and number one lines of scrimmage in America, you're looking at a situation where they probably go undefeated again, and their fate's determined in the postseason by how Oregon and Texas especially, and maybe Notre Dame, Ohio State, or Georgia play to their ceiling. I'm not asking, can Indiana maximize their talent, because the staff did that last year. They did it the year before. So the question we just asked of Oregon, and this is how good Indiana's staff is, Indiana does that every year. And I think they are going to continue to do that, or very close to that every year. The question is, do they have elite number one potential on the lines of scrimmage? And if they do, well, you're going to see a pretty incredible Indiana team yet again this year. Ohio State's question is, can the offensive line improve? It's just that simple. We've seen Ryan Day reload before. We have seen them retool at positions where they lose a ton. We've seen them bring back some units that were a bit questionable or had some issues, maybe were great but not elite, and turn them into elite units. I like to think of Ohio State's D-line. 2022 was pretty good, but not elite. 2023 was an elite run-stop unit, had some questions in pass rush. 2024 was just elite in all phases. And then this past year, it dropped off a little bit, but not that much. Larry Johnson did an incredible job reloading there. The one unit that has been the exception to that rule has been Ohio State's offensive line. And let me give you some evidence for that. So Ohio State, their offense in 2025 against Texas, Indiana, and Miami scored a combined 38 points. 38 points. They put up on average, when you look at average yards, 203, 322, 332 against Texas, Indiana, and Miami, respectively. They didn't even average 300 yards per game, and they didn't even average 14 points in both those games. Now, some of that was due to special teams, let's be honest. But against Indiana and Miami, they only missed one field goal. So many times in those games, they didn't even get down the field. They didn't even get past midfield. And remember, so I was in an argument just before this show began with an Ohio State fan who was simultaneously trying to argue that Ohio State's coaching staff held back the O-line, but that their coaching staff was also the best in America last year, on top of them having like the best roster in America last year by a mile. All three of those things can't be true. They can't be true, especially when you factor in that Ohio State's defense was the most talented last year and was at best number one and at worst tied for one with Indiana and Texas, who also had generationally performing defenses. That doesn't add up. That's not possible. If Ohio State had the best staff in America last year, if they had a great offensive line last year, if just one of those things are true, they go 16-0. If one of those things are true, because they were that talented. They had the best overall player on offense, the best overall player on defense, probably the second best, or at least another top 5 player on defense, whether Sonny Styles or Arvo Reese. And that's factoring in a year where you have Akeem Mesidor, you have Ruben Bain Jr., you have D'Angelo Ponce. It was a loaded class for defense. It really was. Loaded linebacker year, loaded DB year, especially at safety. With Caleb Downs, with KJ Bolden, for example, with some of the surprise safeties that emerged from Miami, with what Indiana had at nickel. Ohio State played a lot of those teams. They played a lot of good defenses. But in those games, outside of Texas, where they didn't run block well, but they pass blocked well, against Indiana and Miami, they didn't run block all that well, and they got torn up in pass protection. They really, really got torn up. In every other game, on average, factoring out those three, they scored 39.1 points, averaged 460 yards, only allowed a half a sack per game, averaged 5.1 yards per carry, and had an average drive of 50.7 yards per drive. Against Indiana and against Miami, they only averaged 35.8 yards per drive. They got sacked 5 times. Even when you take out the sacks, Bo Jackson, basically all the yards he got against Indiana were after contact because the line never got across the line of scrimmage, with rare exception, maybe a play or 2 or 3. And against Miami, they were able to run okay, but that's because Miami at some point decided, okay, hey, we're going to go wide technique, we're going to go light box, we're going to try to cover those elite receivers, and we're going to tee off, and we're just going to dare them to run. And it worked for a drive or two, and Ohio State used that to parlay into RPO, and that's why they were able to make it a game. But eventually Miami made adjustments again, and Ohio State couldn't do anything. The offensive line for Ohio State, I would say that, and probably coaching too, because the line is talented enough not to be a line that has 2 or 3 first-rounders. They're not nearly as talented as those offensive lines from basically any other year of the Ryan Day era, just because recruiting fell off. And they don't have those type of bodies right now, although Sam Greer is that player. Sam Greer, I think, will be a first-rounder, but that's projecting way into the future. They don't have that starting-wise. But with a better system, with better coaching, maybe like Luke Montgomery and Carson Hinsman would have played well enough last year, or Austin Saraveld, to where Ohio State wins it all, and they get drafted higher than they would have been if they had declared in this timeline, if that makes sense. That's Ohio State's biggest question for 2026. While I think there is going to be regression at different places, that is just what I think. They have reloaded time and time again D-line, which I'm pretty high on their D-line for 2027 and implicitly high on them this year. I just think they're young, and it really depends on how spring pans out, whether I view it as a great D-line or an elite D-line. Linebacker, James Laurinaitis has recruited and developed phenomenally there. DB, they've improved at corner. They retooled there in the portal. Don't know if it'll be better than last year with Igbinosun leaving, but it could be. Safety, I don't think you can get better than Caleb Downs, but I love the safety room if Terry Moore's healthy. And then at receiver, you have Jeremiah Smith. They brought guys in at tight end. They have, I would say, tied for first, if the injuries in the spring don't impact them, one of the best running back rooms in the Big Ten. Bo Jackson certainly could be running back one of the Big Ten. Sayan could be QB one of the Big Ten. Even if he isn't, he's a top 5, probably top 5 quarterback at the very worst, looking at things. They have a loaded roster, as always. They have an elite staff, and they reloaded every position. Their only question, and it's been this way last year, it was that way the year before and the year before that. For the past 4 years, including this one, they've had questions in the preseason about the O-line. In 2024, it panned out well until injuries happened. And then in the postseason, they were able to hide enough of the deficiencies with scheme, elite receiver and QB play and defense to still win it all anyway. In 2023, it had some good games, but struggled overall, especially with the run game. In 2025, people were telling me all preseason that I was underestimating the unit. And as wrong as I was in Ohio State last year, thinking they would lose to, at one point, all of Texas, Penn State, and Michigan, and before the season kicked off to Penn State and Michigan, thought they would go 9-3 or 10-2. A lot of the teams they faced disappointed. Ohio State reloaded better than I thought, especially on defense, and they went 12-2. I was right that the offensive line was an issue for them. And it helped me pick them to win every regular season game week by week, but then pick against them in Indiana, in the Indiana Big Ten championship game. And then I sadly, for my own sake of being right, backed them against Miami, who had the best pass rush. And with hindsight, I don't know why I did that. But hindsight's 2020. Austin Saraveld, Luke Montgomery, Carson Hinsman, Joshua Padilla, and Philip Daniels are your projected starting O-line as of right now. This O-line and Indiana's O-line had very similar issues last year in terms of, like, pass protection at least. Indiana's was much better at run blocking, but pass blocking, they were pretty much the same. And how they played in the Miami game showed that. Almost said Michigan there. Indiana was able to get downfield blocks on Miami and really put together a consistent rushing attack. But much like Ohio State, they got absolutely neutered in the pass game. And because of that, Indiana won in a close game. Ohio State lost in a close game. And really, it was the downfield blocking of Indiana and the blocked punt and superior special teams of Indiana, those three things that helped them beat a Miami team that very well could have beaten them and did beat Ohio State in a close competitive game. But in pass blocking, Ohio State with this current lineup really has 5 guards. It's kind of the same as what Indiana had last year. One of their guards, middle of the year, shifted out to tackle when Benson was injured, and Carter Smith is a better run blocker than pass blocker, doesn't have the fluidity or length of a tackle. He's not an NFL tackle, at least right now. That's the same with all of these players here with the Ohio State O-line. But Indiana's O-line was able to do a good job in the postseason because of run blocking, physicality, and they had an excellent scheme that was able to hide their weaknesses until they played 2 first-round defensive ends that were pure pass rush DNs. And then they got hurt, but still were able to block downfield enough to help win their team the game. Ohio State's O-line can be that. They're as talented as Indiana's offensive line. Per recruiting rankings, they're more talented. So there is potential here. It just needs to be mined. It's not the same potential of the O-lines that featured Paris Johnson Jr. They don't have a player that good, or the ones that had Donovan Jackson or Josh Simmons. They don't have players with that high ceiling or that good. But Indiana and Clemson teams that came before then, and the Michigan team in 2023 that won it all, they have shown you do not need those players to win it all on the O-line. You just need guys that are especially excellent at run blocking, very physical, don't allow interior penetration, and who are good enough in pass protection to be able to, keep the defense honest so that you can game control them with the run, stay on schedule, not take too many sacks, but prioritizing a system where you were able to run the ball, keep things going, and not have to rely on the passing attack, which is where more of your turnovers come from, but where more of your touchdowns come from too. It's a more of a high variance thing. When you look at Julian Sayin and how Julian Sayin played last year, he was excellent. He's the most accurate quarterback in college football when he's comfortable. He's more accurate than Arch Manning. He's more accurate than Dante Moore. He's more accurate than Bryce Underwood. He's the most accurate quarterback in college football when he's on. What killed him last year wasn't just the, QB running, which Day talked about this preseason, which is a good thing. It wasn't just that. It was also the fact that his pass protection was it was the lack of a run game was a part of it. It put pressure on him. The lack of his willingness to use his legs didn't help either. His youth didn't help, and that should be his biggest strength this coming year, as he has like a full year starting under his belt. It also, what didn't help him was the O-line didn't have a great scheme, and the pass blocking was so bad that against great defenses, he was under duress constantly. You factor that in with Indiana disguising their coverages, for example, and you have a game where now he starts to become a liability, and just everything disappears. It's why Mendoza, despite not having the same completion percentage as Julian Sayin, was a much better quarterback last year, and when it mattered was more accurate, because he was better able to processed defenses, and was better able to be accurate under pressure than Sayin was. The O-line being great, or at least improving, is so important because if you put Sayin behind the nation's best O-line and you give him competent receivers, you have a very high floor of scoring. You're probably scoring in the mid or high 20s every game, and that with an elite defense will win you every game, period, barring some insane, improbable series of events. There's a reason his PFF grade was in the 90s, why he had a 4-to-1 TDI&T ratio, and why he had an 88.4 QBR. He's a top 5 quarterback in the sport, guys. He could be the best quarterback in the sport. On his worst day, I mean, look at the Indiana and Miami games where he still made some amazing throws and good reads. He's still a top 10 quarterback. He's incredible. So the offensive line being good or being bad directly impacts him. It also directly impacts Bo Jackson, who despite the line's issues last year had 6.1 yards per carry and 1,090 rushing yards. That's because I've seen so many clips where Bo Jackson is breaking people's ankles or dragging them 10 yards forward, getting plenty of yards after contact, making people miss. He had one of the highest forced missed tackle rates and higher yards after contact rates in all college football last year. And that's because A, he's very good, but also B, the guys in front of him didn't do him any favors. They didn't give him many open holes. So him dragging Indiana defenders in the Big Ten title game is one of the more incredible efforts I've ever seen, because Indiana doesn't miss tackles, and they're stronger than you are. They're not as fast as you are, but that's one of the most dedicated and one of the strongest teams in college football over recent memory. They compensated for their lack of maybe raw speed or athleticism at certain positions by just being stronger and smarter than you were and being more dedicated than you were. And Jackson kind of had, in the Big Ten title game last year and in the Miami game, where it looked like a lot of Ohio State players either lacked that commitment or strength, he had that strength. That's what makes him a special player. That's what makes him an elite player. Him behind an elite offensive line could have a J.K. Dobbins-like season. That's how good he is. And it also impacts Jeremiah Smith, obviously, because it doesn't help Julian Sayin get him the football if Julian Sayin is constantly under duress. But Smith really by himself is, he'll continue to get better as he's better developed, but he's already close to as good as he's going to get because he's the best player in college football. But putting Sayin behind a great O-line, and this is why the Arthur Smith hire, I think, is underrated by some. It's not that Arthur Smith is a fantastic play caller. I actually don't think he is all that fantastic of a play caller. It's more so the idea that he knows tight end and O-line well enough to protect Sayin and give Jackson some more wiggle room. And last year, Ohio State didn't have that good of play calling from Brian Hartline anyway. So what would you prefer if you're Ohio State? At the very worst, Arthur Smith is a bad play caller, but Brian Hartline was pretty questionable there last year. So you have bad play call, but now you have, on one hand, an understanding of how an O-line works and of how to protect your quarterback and how to do well in the run game. You have good schematics, maybe not a good play call, but good schematics and good teaching of schematics versus a lack thereof with bad play calling. You pick this all the time. And on top of that, Arthur Smith has the upside that maybe he will be a fantastic play caller. So no matter what, it is a upgrade in terms of running the offense compared to what Ohio State had last year. And that might have answered question 3 for all of you. But the improvement, the scope of improvement for Ohio State offensively is going to entirely depend on the O-line. If the O-line is the same as last year or regresses, the offense will get worse because Carnell Tate's gone. So you subtract an alien from the offense and don't add any improvement, and the offense will actually get worse, even though they return a whole lot if the O-line doesn't improve. When you look at the offense overall last year, it was a great unit, but it wasn't near elite, and it certainly wasn't elite. It was probably puffed up by offensive metrics because they beat up on the weak, and they didn't have enough games against the strong to show how weak they were in certain positions. Michigan, for example, was the second best defense they played in the, well, no, that was actually Wisconsin. Michigan was the third best defense they played in the regular season. They had an efficiency outside the top 30. Wisconsin's efficiency was 25th last year. They gave Ohio State's O-line all types of hell in pass pro and in the run game. Texas didn't give him hell in pass pro, but stalwarted them in the ground game. And, I mean, Texas didn't even finish top 10 in efficiency. They were 11th per ESPN. They did not face many good defenses. They did not face really any complete team until Indiana, who then held them to 10. And then they faced another somewhat complete team in Miami, and Miami held them to 14. So it was a good offense, but it was an offense that honestly was, this is going to be probably a bit bold of me to say, it was an offense that was a lot more like 2023 Penn State's than 2024 Ohio State's, where in big games, Penn State in big games that year, when you take out the garbage time touchdowns, scored 10.5 points per game against Ohio State, Michigan, and Ole Miss. And Michigan that year had a generational defense in efficiency and in talent. Ohio State this year scored 12.7 points per game in big games. Texas, Indiana, and Miami. And Indiana was the only one that had a generationally performing defense. Miami's was elite relative to this year, but still had issues. And Texas's was just good at the end of the year. So the offensive line for Ohio State could be the difference between a 9-3 team or a team that wins it all and goes 15-1, 14-2, or 16-0 in winning it all. That is how important that unit is for not just Ohio State, but for the Big Ten. That's question 3. If Ohio State can answer question 3 to the degree that they have a Joe Moore Award O-line, that team is in the category now of Oregon and Texas roster-wise, and probably, given their recent history, should be the favorite to win it all. If they don't do that, if they stay the same or maybe improve just a little, but don't improve as much as returning production says otherwise, then they're probably going to regress a good bit from where they were last year. The offensive line, because of how much it brings back and therefore the potential it could have, but also the questions it's had in recent memory, will determine a lot of the Big Ten. Moving on to Michigan. I know we're going through these slowly, but I want to go through these slowly. It's very important to look at these questions very closely. I took especially a long time with Ohio State because it's probably the most important position in the Big Ten in terms of determining how a team or how a season goes, I would say, just because of the combination of how much it returns, but how many questions it has. And there isn't really another position that I would say has that. Like Michigan, for example, we'll talk about them here. How talented is Michigan's roster? That's question 4. They don't have a position that returns that much talent. They do have several positions, though, that have very high upside, but much like the Ohio State O-line we just discussed, have a lot of questions, too. For Michigan, if the Wolverines truly have a top 10 roster, as recent recruiting trends would indicate they do, and if they have one of the better staffs in the Big Ten, and I think that is more certain, per se, then maybe they can compete for a title this year, Big Ten or national. But that's asking a lot. There's also the argument that Sharon Moore and his staff did such a bad job developing that maybe it's going to take a year or two for this roster to really get going and for the rust to be sanded off. I'm kind of in the middle there when looking at Michigan. I think that this staff is Michigan's best since 2023. I think it is one of the best staffs in college football, but I can't quite give it Ohio State, Georgia, Indiana benefit of the doubt. I can't do that yet. I can't. What I can do is say that with some of the players they are bringing back, combined with the caliber of team they had last year, and the fact that I would say they probably have the greatest upgrade out of all coaching staffs in college football from last fall to this fall, that Michigan should be a college football playoff contender at least this year. They were fringe top 25. That's what they were. They were a fringe top 25 team. And it shows right here. FPI, S&P Plus, FEI, PFF, efficiency, game control, they all show it. They were a fringe top 25 team. And they were a fringe top 25 team with an easy schedule, mind you. So if they played a tougher schedule, they probably would have been as bad as they were the year before. The roster is what's going to determine how good Michigan is. Because I think the coaching staff is set. It's as set as much as I can say it is. Again, I can't give it OSU, Georgia, Indiana benefit of the doubt, but I can give it benefit of the doubt from the next year and the top of next year. How many future NFL players you have is what's going to determine things more than coaching here. And some of that relates to coaching and development, but I'm talking about how talented they are if Michigan comes close to maximizing their talent. Like what inherent talent that the staff and some of these players can't control exists. Is there a switch in some of these guys where they can become aliens? That's the key question here. Jay Hill is one of the better defensive coordinators in the sport, and he's going to run a 4-2-5 base defensive scheme, and that's the scheme that Michigan has been recruiting for over the past several years. There will be changes, of course, because it's his defense. It's not Wink Martindale's defense. It's not Jesse Minner's or Mike McDonald's defense, but you're going to have similar personnel usage. For Jason Beck, it is a total change, absolute change. They are going to be running what Utah was last year, which was a lot of spread, RPO, using Devin Dampier's legs. I imagine Bryce Underwood is going to be using his legs too. And then you have Kyle Whittingham, who last year put together one of his best teams at Utah, and that was in his final year there, in his 21st year. So I'm pretty convinced that he still has his fastball. I'm pretty convinced of that. When you look at coaching trios, the only two in the Big Ten that I would say are better than Michigan's or in their league, it's Ohio State's and it's Indiana's. Iowa's, I would say, is probably the next one, a little bit lower, them or Oregon's, but Iowa's coordinators are more proven. Michigan is that good of a staff, guys, and their assistant coaches are very good too. If you're Indiana or Ohio State, or maybe Oregon too, with the talent you have and assistants you have, you're not sweating. You're still in the top three, but that's more so saying how good you are than it is saying that Michigan isn't good. Michigan is very well set up from a coaching angle here. I mean, Whittingham went from 5-7, where they had a ton of close losses, to 10-2. They crushed Nebraska in the bowl game. They were top 10 in FPI, close loss to BYU. They competed with Texas Tech more than anyone not named Arizona State or Oregon did. And I loved watching them. Their offense was among the more physical and explosive units in America last year. Defense left some things to be desired from, but they got injured there. And Morgan Scaley's at Utah. He's bringing over Jay Hill from BYU. So, and Jay Hill, I would say, is a better defensive coordinator than Morgan Scaley has been. Runs a better system. Has just done a better job at BYU than Scaley did at Utah. And at Utah, he's won the Pac-12 twice, and that was in this decade. And with hindsight, knowing Cam Rising's situation and his talent level, the fact that he won Pac-12 titles with Cameron Rising, that's pretty impressive. That's pretty impressive. So just to get that out of the way, I don't think Michigan's coaching staff is a question. What is the question is their talent level. So we got Bryce Underwood here. 11 touchdowns, 9 interceptions, 72.6 QBR, 2,428 passing yards. Bryce Underwood is a phenomenal quarterback. He's an excellent quarterback. I say that not to say that he was the best quarterback in America last year, will be this year, but the talent is there. The intangibles are there. The skill set is there. I know that people are going to say Michigan doesn't have a quarterback, but how would Julian Sayin do if a guy that was, I don't know, watching porn for 23 of the 24 hours of his day was coaching him? Like how would Julian Sayin do in that environment? Julian Sayin probably would have transferred out at the end of the year, or tried to transfer like mid-season, or would have been angry at the staff, much like Underwood was. I'm not saying Underwood right now is Sayin. I can't say that. It just can't. Sayin was phenomenal last year. But Underwood was in one of the worst possible situations that a quarterback could be in, especially when taking into account his skill set versus what Sherrone Moore in Michigan wanted to do. That's not the case anymore. As my friend Chris Drew said, they need to use Underwood like a great college QB. They can't obsess about making sure that he is this round one, pick one quarterback. And that should be the case because Underwood is round one, pick one talent. So if you just play him well and he stays healthy, he'll become that. If he plays well, if he wins, if his confidence rises, if he's intelligent. And those are things that are mostly within his control and the staff's control. Let him run around. Let the offensive line protect him. Let him run with the line. Let him get downfield. Don't obsess about making sure he doesn't get hit. Let him play ball. And do that in a system that is going from one of the worst systems in America to one of the best in America. Jordan Marshall, I just talked about Bo Jackson and how good he was for a few minutes. Jordan Marshall, I would say, is close to that. 87.8 PFF grade last year, 932 rushing yards, 6.2 yards per carry, and 10 touchdowns. And while Michigan's offensive line last year showed signs of having high upside, it wasn't well coached, and it wasn't an elite unit. He's a good running back, Jordan Marshall is. And a running back that now with superior coaching, Tony Alford is the only Michigan assistant from 2025 to be on Kyle Whittingham's staff, and that makes sense. He was the best coach on that staff. You know, Marshall and a room with Savion Hyder and Brycen Moore, that with Bryce Underwood's legs could be the best rushing offense in college football. Could be. I didn't say will be. It could be, which there's been a lot of coulds in this Big Ten questions segment. J.J. Buchanan at wide receiver, 427 receiving yards, 5 touchdowns, 16.4 yards per pass attempt or per reception, 427 receiving yards, and he was a true freshman last year. I imagine another year within the system and a quarterback who has a higher upside than Devin Dampier, and pairing him with Andrew Marsh could reap huge benefits. You also have Jamie French Jr., who was a composite high-level 4-star per both Rivals and 24/7 Sports. Didn't play much last year and redshirted with Texas, but Texas had a pretty good receiver room, even with Ryan Wingo not living up to the hype. So I think that at Michigan, he will be better than, say, Samaj Morgan or Channing Goodwin were last year. And then you have Andrew Marsh, who was probably Michigan's best offensive player outside of Justice Haynes last year. 651 receiving yards, 4 touchdowns, 14.5 yards per reception with 45 receptions. I will continue to harken back to the Ohio State game where Underwood was put in a blender by Patricia and Michigan's offense couldn't do anything. And yet I still saw Andrew Marsh get open and beat Ohio State's defensive backs. Michigan retaining him and Whittingham retaining him is absolutely key. He could be one of the best receivers in college football next year if his development continues on the track that it was on in last fall. You also have John Henry Daly on defense. John Henry Daly with 11.5 sacks. I'd expect him, if healthy, to have 7.5 or 8.5. This year, you're just going to have some drop-off in the Big Ten. 51 pressures, 2 forced fumbles, 92 PFF grade. Was epic before his tragic injury. I think he tore his Achilles. So I imagine it'll take some time for him to get to full health in the fall, but that was a big get for Michigan out of the portal. Has an argument, if healthy, to be one of the best defensive ends in the Big Ten, maybe even the best. You also have Yair Hill Jr. at corner, returning, started for Michigan last year, an interception, 5 pass breakups, a 77.6 PFF grade. Really high ceiling, future NFL player if properly developed, and unlike the previous staff, I trust this staff to do exactly that. And last but not least, we got Smith Snowden at quarterback or at cornerback, transferring in from Utah. 9 pass breakups, 2 interceptions, 37 total tackles, a PFF grade that is around 70. With Smith Snowden and with Yair Hill and Zeke Berry, you have possibly one of the best corner groups in America. It depends on the development, as you have Ohio State, Iowa, Indiana, Oregon. I would even say USC and Penn State with who they have, that they could pan out to be that good depending on how things fall. There's a lot of great teams in the Big Ten, but Michigan's roster, I would say it has the talent. I would say it has some of the best talent in America. The question is how much of it is maximized. Is talent at positions like D tackle or sections of the O-line or tight end or depth at receiver or linebacker there that isn't as proven as these players we've talked about but can emerge? And how good is this coaching staff? Am I rating it properly? Am I overrating it a bit? Am I maybe even underrating it a bit? We'll have to see. But man, I like what I'm seeing out of Michigan. Not as much as Ohio State, Oregon, or Indiana. So I have Michigan losing to all those teams this fall. But outside of that, in the Big Ten, I don't really like anyone else above Michigan except for those three. Last but not least, very briefly, just go back there. Last but not least, we have USC and their defense. Will Lincoln Riley and Gary Patterson mesh and improve USC's defense? That's a big question. It's a loaded question. So USC last year, first in recruiting, they got the number 1 overall recruiting class. They had one of Riley's better teams in terms of efficiency and FPI. They won 9 games all in the regular season, so they were 9-3. And they lost that bowl game to TCU, but again, I don't really take much stock in bowl games. Their roster looks solid this coming year, both on defense and on offense. And when you look at their lines of scrimmage, I think Riley could have his best lines of scrimmage ever at USC. The problem is the depth, the youth at some positions, and just some of the questions, I would say. Like Gary Patterson has not been a DC in over a decade. He hasn't been a successful coach in terms of his final few years at TCU. TCU weren't that good. He hasn't been a successful coach in close to a decade. And he was out of coaching for a while. So I wonder how good of a fit that's going to be. I'm kind of in the middle of it. I don't think it'll be a disaster. I also don't think it'll be the best defensive coordinator hire in the world. So will it be a better defense than what Lynn had last year or the year before that? Will he be a better defensive coordinator than D'Anton Lynn? What of the positional coaches there? I know they lost Doug Belk and they lost Eric Henderson. So they have some changes there at certain position groups on defense. With Riley, I know, due to how last year went, that offense is going to be good. I mean, their EPA per play last year was 4th. And that was because in these games, just on a per play basis, they were able to wreck a lot of opposing defenses effortlessly. Like they blew out Michigan. They handled Michigan State. They blew out their non-con teams outside of Notre Dame. They were able to move the ball well on Notre Dame and Oregon. They were able to, blow out Northwestern. They had that epic comeback against Iowa. They lost very close to Illinois in a game where, if not for some, injuries, they probably win that game. They were good last year. I mean, that was a top 20 fringe, top 15 team last year. But a lot of that was because Riley could finally run the offense he wanted to, which included a really effective ground game, and their defense was just okay. With this schedule, they're going to need better than just an okay defense. They're going to need a good defense in order to compete for the playoffs with this schedule. Braylon Shelby, Alex Van Sumeren, Jade Abasiri, I hope that's how you say his name, and Cameron Crawford is USC's projected starting defensive line. They have appropriate size there. They have, in totality, when you look at this projected defensive line, they have a good amount of sacks and pressures assigned to each player. They have good talent. The question is, can they utilize it? And do they have enough depth to rotate on the D-line and rotate on defense in case someone doesn't pan out or someone goes down? Because they did not have that last year. And look at this defense. Look at it. Outside of occasionally getting pressure here or there, it was not a good unit. It wasn't. I mean, in opposing yards per carry, they had one of the worst defenses in America last year. Opponent red zone touchdown percentage was pretty bad. Every number you look at outside of sack percentage, they were mediocre in. The D line and probably their corners were the best spots, but linebacker was bad. Special teams was inconsistent. Safety did not have depth, so when they were inconsistent or injured there, they weren't good. The defense in some cases actually regressed from the prior year, while in other cases improving. So it's a big year for USC. It's a big year for their defense. If Patterson comes in and they do well and he can be there for a few years, then maybe my prediction that Riley one day will win a title with USC's resources comes to fruition. If not, you might be looking at a one and done, and then the following year he'll have to have his third defensive coordinator in 3 years, and that wouldn't be good. So that is question 5, the 5th biggest question in the Big Ten, I believe, is will Lincoln Riley and Gary Patterson mesh and improve USC's defense? That's the final question that I have, because it's a top 5 Big Ten questions video. In the future, around like the spring games more so, or maybe after that, I'll come out with Big Ten questions for every Big Ten team. There you go. Oh, that segment was so long. I feel like with I think Indiana and Ohio State were the longest. I think I started not rambling, well, maybe somewhat rambling, but I think I went in to a deeper explanation of those position groups struggle, either struggles or questions, or praising certain players on those teams more than anyone else, which is kind of a shame because Oregon and Michigan had the most slides. But Oregon and Michigan, I also think, were more straightforward, where they were about the entire roster and just talent-wise. Indiana and Ohio State were about certain positions, the lines of scrimmage, which I love to talk about, and also about, like, praising other parts of their teams because I completely trust other parts of those teams for the most part. It's just those areas are where I have questions. Anyway, let's talk about some breakout candidates for the Big Ten. Let's talk about that. And then we will get into some other positions. That sound good? I think it sounds good. Okay. Yeah. Here are 6 candidates in the Big Ten to break out in 2026 and either achieve much more than they did the year before or have good first years with new coaching staffs. These Big Ten teams have a big chance to make a splash this upcoming season, overachieve preseason expectations, or make a big leap forward from where they were last fall. Let's start out by talking about the Iowa Hawkeyes. This is one of 6 Big Ten teams that we will discuss that are breakout candidates for 2026. For Iowa, I am looking at the fact that Mark Gronowski, Jennings Dunker, Logan Jones, that's the quarterback and then the best tackle and center on the team, and Logan Jones, along with Dunker, are probably the best offensive linemen on the team, are departing. Much of Iowa's defensive line is leaving. Carson Sherrar at linebacker is leaving, and Reese Dakin, their excellent punter, is departing for Michigan State. Caden Wheatgen at return specialist is also departing, and he had what I think like 4 touchdowns on special teams last year. So Iowa does lose a lot, but they returned Tim Lester at OC and Phil Parker at DC. Ferentz has his proven process. You'll always get good strength and conditioning, development, scouting, and physicality at Iowa. The question is what talent they have. They return tackle Trevor Locke, Cade Piper at guard, Leighton Jones at guard, and Deshaun Lee and Zach Lutmer at corner. That might be the best corner duo in the nation, in America. And I also like Bryce Hawthorne on the defensive line. They do return much of their receiver group, so there should be some improvement there. You also have DJ Vaname at tight end, who I have as kind of an All-American or close to that caliber player. And just look at Iowa last year. They were 18th in FPI, 12th in S&P+, 15th in FEI, and 14th in efficiency. They were 20th in points per play, 10th in opponent points per play, and 13th in points per play margin. I mean, that was a team that I would argue, if not for priors and recruiting talent holding them back in ratings, They were probably a top 15 caliber team at the end of last year. And I think you saw that where I don't take a lot of stock into bowl games, but Vanderbilt didn't have a ton of opt outs. Iowa didn't have a ton either. They each had, I think, a few. And Iowa was able to kind of put pedal to the metal on them. I don't take as much stock into that, though, as I do the fact they played Indiana and Oregon very competitively, and at points in the fourth quarter had a, you know, greater than 50% chance to outright win in that game. So I love Iowa this year. I think they are an obvious breakout candidate in 2026 to reach the playoffs, maybe win 10 games or 9 regular season games. What a story it would be if Kirk Ferentz, retires after this year because he gets Iowa 10 or 11 wins and they reach the playoffs. That would be incredible. Michigan is another team I'm looking at to be a breakout team. Justice Haynes leaves for Georgia Tech. You lose Derek Moore, Rayshon Benny, Cole Sullivan, and Jimmy Rolder, but not really much else. Best running back and the defensive front, a front that was a bit overrated last year outside of the linebacker play, they leave. What comes in, John Henry Daly, Smith Snowden. What comes back on defense, Yair Hill, and if healthy, you got Rod Moore. You have Mason Curtis. You have Zeke Berry. And then offensively, Andrew Sprague, Jake Guanera, Blake Frazier, Nathan Ifabi. At wide receiver, J.J. Buchanan comes in and Andrew Marsh returns. And you also got Bryce Underwood returning at quarterback. And at running back, you have the return of Jordan Marshall. An incoming true freshman, Savion Hyder, who could be an immediate, impact caliber running back. Kyle Whittingham and his coordinators Jason Beck and Jay Hill are in year one, and Michigan's schedule is among the toughest in America. But based on their recruiting, and based on what Whittingham and his staff have been able to do with less, you could make the reasonable assumption that this should be a top 10 team this coming year, with higher upside depending on how other teams utilize their talent, and depending on things that are just, within margin of error, and maybe all of that goes Michigan's way in a positive way. They had a top 25 team last year with a lot of good players, but piss poor coaching. So what determines whether or not they will break out this year is what talent they have left on their roster. If they truly do have a top 10 or even 15 caliber roster, with the staff they have, they'll at least win 9 games and flirt with the college football playoff, if not outright make it, and maybe beat one of Oregon, Indiana, or Ohio State on the way. If Michigan truly is talent depleted, then you could be looking at a 7-5 or 8-4 caliber season. Michigan, much like Iowa, I do really like to break out. Most of the teams we'll talk about here, I like. Michigan is the highest power-rated team, in my opinion, out of these 6 Big Ten breakout candidates. Penn State, one that maybe I don't like as much as other people, but they're a candidate, so let's talk about them. You have Rocco Becht at quarterback, Chase Sowell at receiver, Caleb Bacon at linebacker, Benjamin Brahmer at tight end, and so many others from Iowa State and other places transferring in. D'Anton Lynn and Taylor Mauser and Matt Campbell, much like Kyle Whittingham and his staff, are in year one. And the only difference between these two is that Penn State's recruiting class fell apart. A lot of Penn State players left for Virginia Tech. And you also have to take into account that last year's Penn State team was senior laden, was top heavy. And a lot of those players, either some of them left for their final year of eligibility, others just had no more eligibility, like Drew Aller, and are declaring for the NFL draft. Katron Allen, Vega Ione, Denida Sutton, Zane Durant, Zakee Wheatley, all huge losses. 46 outgoing transfers, pretty small high school recruiting class, a lot of players just leaving, period. It's a huge change of the guard. The good news for Penn State is their schedule's easy. It's why their win total's at 9.5, same as Ohio State's, despite being a far worse team than Ohio State. They were actually better than Michigan last year, in part because they were so talented that even with horrific coaching and a horrific culture, I would say, last year, the talent was good enough to just carry them to be inside the top 20, top 15 in terms of ratings. If James Franklin and his staff were as good as Curt Cignetti and his staff, Penn State does go 16-0 and win it all. And that's my fault for thinking James Franklin could ever do that. That is a huge facepalm moment on my channel equivalent to deluding myself into thinking that Scott Frost would win the Big Ten West in 2022. It's a huge mark. Not ashamed of it. We got so much right last year, and that was just one thing that was just like, if only I could have changed that, I would have changed my thoughts on Penn State. But the past is the past. Moving forward, I expect Matt Campbell to do a better job than James Franklin at development, at utilizing talent, and in-game coaching. The problem is, can he acquire talent, star talent, in the same way that Franklin did? Because if he cannot, then the margin, the positive margin between him and Franklin in the development and scouting area has to keep getting larger and larger and larger, the fewer blue chippers or fewer top-end players that Campbell is able to recruit relative to what Franklin could recruit. So I'm super curious to see how that pans out. Super curious. And that's all going to depend on how the 2027 and 2028 classes pan out. They're an intriguing team. They can easily make the playoffs with that schedule. I just think the roster isn't as complete as the prior two rosters we've discussed. UCLA is the worst roster we've talked about so far. But I would say that they have outside of Michigan, the biggest coaching upgrade. Colin Hitchler at DC, Dean Kennedy at OC, and Bob Chesney as the head coach are also in year one. We're not going to talk much about UCLA last year, who they lost because they were awful. But we will talk about the fact that they returned Nico Iamaleava and Wayne Knight III, Landon Ellis, Sahir West, and Drew Spinogatti are players you should be paying attention to. Wayne Knight is JMU's star running back from last year. Landon Ellis is their top receiver. Sahir West, their top D-end. And Spinogatti is their top linebacker. JMU was a pretty damn good team last year. And they'll have a quarterback upgrade. And many of those players will be dealing with the same staff, so they'll get another year of development. It won't be as big of a reset because of how familiar they're all with each other. On top of that, UCLA is one of the easier schedules in the Big Ten. So while I don't think they'll be as good as any of the prior teams we've talked about, they might, if everything works out, have a better chance than a Michigan or Iowa of reaching the playoffs because they don't have a tough bundle of teams they have to face. But that's a pretty tall ask because they also have far inferior players compared to any of the previous teams, Penn State, Michigan, and Iowa, that we've discussed. I love Bob Chesney, though, and I do think UCLA is pretty much guaranteed to go to a bowl game. I love the over on their 5.5 win total. We also have USC, the Trojans. They sort of broke out last year. Sort of. But I also think they could have done more. I'm kind of leaning over and scratching my chin, which I like to do sometimes when I'm, deep in thought live, when I have to multitask, talk to you, but also think something immediately off the top of my head. The Illinois loss, learning that Michigan was being led by the ultimate clown. So while the win was impressive from a physicality angle, it wasn't like USC beat this top 15 team. They beat like an okay team and crushed them. And the performance against Notre Dame, the fact that Oregon played one of their least disciplined games of the year and beat you by double digits and should have beaten you by more, and the slow start to UCLA, letting Michigan State score that many points when their culture and staff were totally screwed to begin with, it kind of makes the season feel like it had some empty calories to it. It wasn't an empty calorie season. It wasn't. I mean, that Michigan one was still good. The Iowa win, I think, was the most impressive win of the year. That showed they have some toughness and a good, solid culture. And I do like USC moving forward, but Mekhi Lemon and Jacoby Lane are going to be hard to replace. Kamari Ramsey, even with his inconsistency, is going to be hard to replace. They are losing some good talent. They're making a change on the defensive staff in a way that makes me think, like, come on, Lynn's a good DC. We know he is. Like, maybe he wasn't the perfect fit, but it's not like he was an awful fit or overrated. It felt like more of the same, but with slight improvements in physicality and things meshing together, which, look, is good. This was one of USC's better teams in recent memory, but they should also be better than this. I like them 2027 after that recruiting class is a year of development, because I do like their strength and conditioning staff. I love USC's offensive staff, and Patterson does have some upside as DC. This is a team that is power rated in my mind similarly to Iowa, and a little bit below Michigan, but well above Penn State and UCLA. Their problem is similar to Michigan's. Their schedule is insane. They have to play Oregon and Ohio State. They do get them at home, but they'll have a significant roster disadvantage. And they'll have a roster disadvantage again against Indiana, and they have to play them on the road in November. And that's when Indiana comes off of a bye. USC does too, but so does Indiana. I think that Jaden Mayav is a top 10 quarterback. King Miller, along with Waymon Jordan, and some of the recruits they have back there, could be the best running back group in America. Tanu Kynes and Terrell Anderson is good enough at receiver for me to know that this offense is going to be humming. And I expect Jakeem Stewart to have a good breakout season. And for the defense to at least make some improvements because they're more talented than they were last year. It does feel like, from a USC standpoint, though, with how little they did in the portal and how much they spent on that class, that this is a year that is meant to set up for a huge 2027 campaign. Maybe I'm wrong. USC could make a splash, though, this year. If everything goes right, they could seriously win it all. I said that last year, and just think about how good that offense was, and if that defense was top 20. They could have been, they could have been Georgia caliber and good enough to at least have a reasonable pick that they could have won it all last year. If the defense really did take a huge step forward, and it ended up just not doing that. This year you could do the same. They could also make the college football playoff. So that's why I like them as a breakout candidate. And last but not least, we have Washington. Washington. I love this defense. I really do. And I love the defense more than I do the offense, honestly. And I think the offense is going to be good. They'll have a much better O-line. And receiver, while it will drop off due to losing Denzel Boston, you get Desmond Roebuck back, and you get Damon Williams back. My thing with Washington, and why I like them, is it's literally the defense. Darren Conley transferring in, Rashawn Clark. You have Ephesians Prysock. You have Emmanuel Carnley. And Ryan Walters' system, it's such a good defense as long as it has good enough players to run it. And I think they have good enough players to run it. Oh, Ephesians Prysock left. So, yeah, I'm probably going to cut that out of this segment when I release it. But Rylan Dillard-Allen, Alex McLaughlin, Rashawn Clark, Jacob Manu, Zuri Alexander, just looking at the depth chart there, it's a loaded defense. I wouldn't be shocked if this defense finished top 10 in efficiency. I certainly think it'll finish top 20 or top 15. The question for Washington is that they have to play at USC and host Iowa back-to-back, and they have to travel, they have to host Indiana and travel to Oregon back-to-back at the end of the year. So the schedule's challenging, and Adam Muhammad, Jonah Coleman, and Denzel Boston were a huge part of their offensive success against inferior teams when their offensive line wasn't really good, but their skill position players and defensive soundness were good enough to perform well. I do think there are enough questions to say that this team isn't one of the better ones we're talking about right now, but I think it's in the middle. Worse than Michigan, USC, possibly worse than Iowa, but definitely better than UCLA and Penn State, I believe. Jed Fish is a very underrated coach. He has a great DC in Ryan Walters. He himself is a good play caller. And I really do need to fix this. It's happened in 2 videos now, and I won't edit this out because I think it's funny. Jimmy Daugherty was let go by Washington. So that will be changed next time we talk about Washington. The OC name will be replaced by whoever the current OC hire is, if they have hired a new one. But those are my Big Ten breakout candidates for 2026. Let me know which Big Ten team you think will make a splash, or teams plural, down in the comment section below. Now we'll talk about SEC breakout candidates. These 5 SEC teams have a great shot to make a splash this fall. Let's talk about the first one, that being Auburn. Auburn brings in Byron Brown, Keyshawn Singleton, Chaz Nimrod from USF, an offense that was very efficient last year, and a team in USF that was top 25 in FPI to finish the season. Deshaun Womack comes in from Ole Miss, and Brycen Washington transfers in from Baylor. This is a roster that, outside of a few players, is mostly going to be built up with transfers in the starting and two deep lineups. Joel Gordon, the OC, and Alex Golesh are in their first year. DJ Durkin has been retained by Alex Golesh to be Auburn's defensive coordinator, which I think is a great decision. Cam Coleman, Eric Singleton Jr., Malcolm Simmons, those three electric receivers left. Coleman to Texas, Singleton to Florida, Simmons to Texas Tech. Very unfortunate, but you probably just needed to hit the reset button with how bad Hugh Freeze did and probably some of the issues they had inside the program. Keldrick Falk departs for the NFL. Kayan Lee transfers out to Tennessee. What I like about Auburn is kind of this potential that they have to do what Indiana did in 2024, at least a Walmart version of it. I will never predict a team, with rare exception, to do what IU did in 2024. I just don't think anyone has as good of a staff as Cignetti, or that there is a coach as good as Cignetti. I don't. But Golesh is a great coach, and he did a good job scouting and developing at USF. Combine that with some of Auburn's talent, a great DC that knows what he's doing. Why couldn't they win like 8, 9, or 10 games even this year? Why couldn't they? Especially if they win them in close fashion with good coaching. Auburn last year was a fringe top 25 power rated team. Horrific offense, excellent defense. Things kind of, I think, fell apart down the stretch, but still a really excellent team. Underrated, I would say, by metrics, the defense of Auburn was. And now you're in the situation where, with, a tough schedule as always, but a good coaching staff, a roster that in theory is less talented, but in actuality might be better than last year's, you can go out and work and win some games. I like Auburn this year to at least show competency. I don't quite like them to be in the playoffs or even a playoff contender, but there's a lot of high variance here with the Tigers. Florida. Now we're talking about a team that I love this year. I love Florida. Losing parts of the O-line like Jake Slaughter, Damian George, and Austin Barber, and then Caleb Banks and Tyreek Sapp from the defensive line. But Jaden Baugh comes back. Eric Singleton Jr. transfers in. Vernell Brown and Dallas Wilson come back at receiver. Jaden Woods could be the best defensive end in the country, and he's back. Same with Cameron James, and Miles Grimm at linebacker's back. Buster Faulkner at OC, Brad White at DC, and John Summerall, the head coach. The OC and DC combo could be one of the best in the sport. If Summerall is as good of a coach as his G5 peers think, and that translates to the Power 4, Florida could have one of the best staffs in college football in the SEC this coming year. I know that metrically they weren't good last year, but a huge part of that is because they fired Napier mid-season, and outside of the Georgia game, the team just quit after that. So Tennessee manhandled them. Ole Miss, they did an admirable job against, but they, didn't do a ton there. There is a game I'm forgetting where they got absolutely, I think, maybe it was Tennessee, but I think there was another game outside of that where they got completely mollywopped after Napier was fired. They didn't look good against Mississippi State. They barely beat a Texas team that really regressed. They lost to USF, and they looked horrific against an LSU team that just wasn't that good. The roster was there. The development staff and play calling was not. And I think Florida has those things on top of the roster. I love them big this fall. LSU, it's actually another team that really disappointed in metrics. Offense was horrible. Defense was good, great, but as the year progressed, they eventually just kind of mailed it in. Really, you saw that a lot with the SEC teams that made coaching changes. Like LSU, Florida, and Auburn, when their coaches were active, all had elite defenses. They kind of mailed it in as the season went on, and okay, we're checked out, we're done here. With LSU, They return Whit Weeks, they return DJ Pickett, PJ Woodland, a lot of key backfield players. They bring in transfer Princewell Unman-Malin from Ole Miss. Sam Levitt transfers in from ASU. One of the better O linemen, pass blocking wise in the country, and Jordan Seaton will be transferring in and is with the Tigers. They do lose quite a bit, like Mansur Delane, AJ Halsey, Harold Perkins, West Weeks. They really aced their portal additions under Brian Kelly defensively, but the offense was just horrific. And I was never high on Garrett Nussmeier. Maybe I was too pessimistic about him, but the injuries to him and to the offense really took a toll. And Brian Kelly's ineptitude and incompetence, well, cost what could have been a very good LSU team a successful season. Now they'll have to rebuild with Lane Kiffin and Charlie Weiss, and he used the strategy of Alex Golesh in retaining the DC from the previous regime. He kept Blake Baker. This is probably the most obvious contender we'll talk about to make a splash in the SEC. We have Missouri. Missouri went 8-5 last year, and the only reason it was that bad was due to injuries. They were impressive on defense. They had a very impressive ground game with Ahmad Hardy, who comes back along with running back Jamal Roberts. And Robert Woodyard Jr. could be one of the better linebackers in the SEC. I love Drinkwitz. I like Corey Batoon paired with Chip Lindsey. I think that their staff is good. Their biggest issue, if I'm being honest, is the schedule and how it aligns with a offense and defense that both lose a ton. Offense makes a change at quarterback, loses some at receiver. It's really a run-centric offense. They also lose their OC Kirby Moore, who's the new head coach at Washington State. And defensively, they lose close to all their starters and a lot of rotational guys. So if they can reload on defense, they'll have a good year. If they can't and they really regress there, it could be a rough time in Missouri, in Farrett Field. Tennessee is the final team we'll talk about. Much like Missouri and Auburn, I either like them more long-term or have questions about them this year. It's more so Florida and LSU, who I think obviously will get better and compete for the playoffs. Tennessee is a curious case. Wonderful offense, horrific defense last year. A lot like USC, probably a bit of a worse version than USC. They, in bringing in Jim Knowles, made an excellent hire for the long term. Knowles is an elite defensive coordinator. Takes time to implement his scheme, but once he has it implemented, you have elite defenses, and few DCs can say that. They also hired Derek Owings as their new strength and conditioning coach. And that was a great hire. Just look at what he did at Indiana and James Madison before then with Curt Cignetti. Faison Brandon at quarterback. I think he's going to start, and I think he's going to be good at the end of the year at least. And they bring back Mike Matthews and Braylon Staley at wide receiver. They have Amari Campbell and Chaz Coleman, incoming Penn State transfers, on defense who should help bring familiarity and help Jim Knowles' scheme get implemented faster. Coleman's a phenomenal pass rusher, a bit raw, but I think with good development, he'll be great. And then Amari Campbell's pretty solid at linebacker. The only question about Tennessee is how quickly these changes cash in. It's not a question of when, because they will. If not this year, Tennessee will be a phenomenal team next year with the DC strength and conditioning and recruiting changes in a positive direction that they have made. Those are my SEC breakout candidates for 2026. Let me know what you think down in the comments section below. Thank you. Okay, I think we're at a natural break point here. I do feel like I need water, and we're definitely going to be live here for another hour, I would say. Maybe just a little bit longer than that. So I am going to take a quick 5-10 minute break here, and then we will be back to close out this segment. See you guys very soon. All right, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for your patience. I really appreciate it. Okay, let's close this out by talking about a few things. Something that I want to start off with is talking about the top three coaches. And we're going to begin this by talking about Day, then Kirby Smart, then Curt Cignetti. We're going to talk about these. And the first one is going to be about why I love Ryan Day. And I think that you also should appreciate Ryan Day. Really. I love Ryan Day. Seriously. He's a great man of high character, and I think he is underrated by the general public and many within his own fan base. When Ryan Day reacts to a problem, he obsesses about it and then goes on to fix it like no other. He's incredible at that. You saw it with the defense. You're seeing it now with how he's trying to ensure that the offensive line is properly developed and recruited. I think you've even seen an attempt at it with special teams, bringing in Jackson Corville at kicker last year. That didn't work out, and now he's trying out a new kicker this year as Jaden Fielding is leaving. His ability as well to motivate his team and get them to put pedal to the metal when facing a truly elite team is also what makes him one of the best leaders and coaches in the sport. So with Ryan Day in Ohio State, they're the best program in college football right now, in my opinion. And I'm pretty confident in that assertion. Day has had just so much success over the past several seasons. He has been at Ohio State since 2019, and now you are looking at him entering his 8th year as the Buckeye head coach. Their recruiting has consistently stayed in the top 5. They have consistently been, every year since he's been there, they have been top 3 in FPI. Top 3. You know how incredible that is? To be top 3 in FPI every single season you're at a program. There's only one other coach to have achieved that. And in his final year that faltered, that was Nick Saban at Alabama. To have a top 3 FPI score every year is incredible. It's why he's an elite coach. And they're pretty much always efficient. They are always at the top end of the sport. They always win their big games or compete in them at the very least. And they develop at a level that translates the recruits they bring in to the NFL and helps them succeed in the NFL. He doesn't just build his players up to be fantastic athletes. He builds them up to be great men of character. I mean, just look at this 5-year trend. You know, no major issues, no down years, not perfect in every year, but they reload at large portions or parts of their roster every year. And they're the top program in college football right now. They just are, whether or not you like that. Last year, it was them in Indiana when you look back on it. Those were the best teams in the sport, the most consistent teams in the sport. Indiana was more balanced. Ohio State was more specialized. Ohio State was more talented. Indiana was better coached. And you see the talent in Ohio State's EPA per play margin, where they finished number 1 by quite a bit. And how you often can measure if a team is the most talented or not is how they do against the worst teams they play. Because in those games, you don't need coaching at all. You just need better athletes. And if you have the best athletes, they're just going to take over and absolutely dominate. And with Ohio State, you saw that last year, where their struggles were in some of the bigger games where they still played competitively. They just happened to lose to Indiana and Miami instead of beating them. And then they happened to beat Texas earlier in the year instead of losing to them. That was the most talented team in college football last year. And it's admirable and speaks to Day's process because, again, he was in year 7 last year, entering year 8. He didn't inherit that roster. He built it, and it was the most talented in the land. They were also number 1 in success rate margin, 4th in points per play margin, 3rd in yards per point margin, and they were 2nd or 3rd in FPI, S&P+, FEI, PFF efficiency, and game control, only behind Indiana, and in game control and FEI, they were behind fellow Big Ten traveler, Oregon. This was a great team last year. And entering the season, I think Ohio State will have a great team yet again. Will it be as good as this team, as talented? We'll have to see. But it's once again going to be a team that is going to be close to the top of the sport, that is going to be competing for a national title. Ohio State right now is the favorite to win the national title. And that is because of Ryan Day, who's 82-12 at Ohio State. You know how insane that is? I said a while ago that he's a better coach than Urban Meyer, and people didn't believe me, and there's probably people that still don't believe me. He is a better coach than Urban Meyer. And I know that close to for a fact because of the type of teams that he's had to face at Ohio State compared to the type of teams Urban Meyer had to face at Ohio State. Meyer in his career is a better coach than Ryan Day just because of the totality of his achievements. But the Ohio State Ryan Day is better than the Ohio State Urban Meyer because Ryan Day had to face Michigan when they were up. He had to face Penn State at least the same level, if not when Penn State was more up than on average when Meyer had to play them. He didn't have to play up Michigan State, but up Michigan or up Penn State is more deadly than up Michigan State. Days had to play Big Ten in the new expansion era, having to face Dan Lanning. He'll have to face Lincoln Riley this year. He has had to deal with Nick Saban too, also has to deal with Dabo Swinney, and helped end Dabo Swinney's reign of terror on college football. He's had a deal with Kirby Smart, and he's come away with pretty much the same win percentage and similar success in winning the Big Ten, in reaching the playoffs. He had a more impressive and dominant playoff run in 2024 than Ohio State did in 2014. And recruiting is harder at Ohio State now than it was when Meyer was there, because you're still the best program, or at worst the second best program behind Alabama all time. But back then you could just say that and that was final. Like, that determined recruiting a lot of the time, along with effort. Now it's not just effort and past prestige, it's money. And that evens the playing field. And Ohio State still has recruited at a top 5 level. He's underrated by so many people. And there are people who, there's always people who overrate their coach. And there are some people that act like Day is Nick Saban, and that's probably insane. But no one right now is Nick Saban. Cignetti's not even Nick Saban. Kirby Smart is not Nick Saban. Certainly no one else is. Those are the top 3 coaches in college football. But there are so many within Day's fan base where they act like the only reason he has this success is because Ohio State's just so much more talented than everyone else, and every loss is him screwing things up, where they're acting like he should be undefeated and 15-0 or 16-0 every year at Ohio State. And that's just not reality. That is so far removed from reality. In the same way that Ohio State's program does play a huge part in its success, Ryan Day also plays into Ohio State's success on his own. Like, if Ohio State had several other head coaches, they would not be where they're at. Day is that good. And I know that some have moved him ahead of Kirby Smart. His consensus placement among coaches is now second, or in some cases number 1, depending on where you look. But I would encourage a lot of Ohio State fans watching this, or college football fans who watch this and think that Day just wins because of talent that he doesn't recruit. I'd encourage you to think he recruits that talent. Otherwise, how does it get there, as he's the leader of that program? And B, think about all the coaches in previous memory who've had access to talent. Think of like Michigan's Sharon Moore, for example. Why haven't they won? It's because they were bad at their job. Day is elite at his job. He's an elite recruiter and developer, and that's why Ohio State's the number 1 program in college football right now, and that's why they are going to be like the best, second best, third best, definitely top 5 program at the very worst moving forward. They're always going to be competing for a national title every year. That's why I love Ryan Day. That's why I think he's a top 3 coach, and that's why you should think of him as an elite coach as well. He also makes fantastic staff hires. Let's talk about Kirby Smart, though, because I think Kirby Smart recently has earned a lot of hate. The hate meter, the hate crowd has turned on Kirby Smart after this past season. Kirby Smart's not perfect. He is certainly not perfect, and every man, even the greatest men, have flaws. But man, I have been so impressed by how he handled adversity in 2024 and 2025 as well. And you should be too. Going 23-5 over the past 2 years in the context of Georgia's schedule, of some of their injuries, and what their team has been and what it's faced, is a sign that Kirby Smart still has his fastball. He's a top coach, and he is not washed like some in college football media are starting to preach. Think about it this way. Kirby Smart, right now, when you look at how he's performed, how Georgia has performed, he's going through a down spell. There's no doubt about that. But in his down spell, where he is 23-5, Ryan Day is 26-4. Curt Cignetti is 27-2. Not that far off from what Georgia's doing. Not that far off at all, right? And sure, Georgia hasn't had the playoff success that those two have had. They haven't even had the regular season success that Indiana has had, though scheduling can play into a part of that, but I digress. Still, though, they've beaten Texas. They've crushed them. They're 3-0 against them. They finally beat Alabama this past season. They beat Ole Miss in the regular season. And outside of 2 losses to Ole Miss, 2 losses to Alabama, and a loss to Notre Dame where most of the team was injured. You had a delay due to the tragic terrorist attack in Louisiana in Baton Rouge. And then you had Gunnar Stockton starting his first game of the year when he was not nearly as ready as he was last year and will be this year. They've just lost to top-end teams and programs. That's really it. All you're seeing from Georgia right now is a regression from their peak to their mean. It's no different from what Ohio State had in 2021 after their 2019 season where they steadily declined, and then they steadily rose again to their peak. And after their peak in 2024, you're probably going to see them steadily regress a little bit, but still be elite, or still be within striking distance of elite. That's what you've seen from Georgia recently. They're still recruiting top 5 every year, just like Ohio State is. They're still an NFL factory, like Ohio State, and like the Alabama program that inspired Kirby Smart to turn Georgia into a power. And they're still winning. I know they don't have a playoff win. I know that. But Ohio State missed the playoffs in 2021, lost in a close game in 2022, and missed it in 2023. They went through their dry spell due to a variety of factors. Some of their best teams didn't even see the national championship game because of a close loss or mismatches. And I feel like that is very similar with Georgia. They have different strengths and weaknesses than Ohio State does. But these two programs right now are, I think Ohio State's the number 1 program. Georgia I only have right now as the 4th best program because of the lack of postseason success over the past 2 years, and they don't have the budgets that a lot of the top Big Ten programs do. But they're still so close to being that best program. Georgia is. They're so close there. I mean, look at their team last year. They were a top 7 team in most metrics: game control, FEI, S&P plus, FPI, 8th in efficiency. PFF graded them as a top 15 team, but PFF's grades are notorious for not being able to take into account strength of schedule. So you see some G5 teams that are fringe top 10 or top 15. That's just insane. They, in yards per point margin, were 11th, points per play margin 20th. Success rate and EPA per play margin were pretty suspect, I think is the best word. But they were also one of the youngest teams in college football last year. They, Oregon, Ohio State, and Texas lost a ton from 2024 entering 2025. Ohio State was a bit older in their 2 deep and did a phenomenal job developing and hitting on their recruits. Like, phenomenal. And they became the most talented team yet again. Oregon they lost a ton, were one of the youngest teams in America last year. They probably did the best job out of the four of reloading, because while Ohio State went from being number 1 overall and number 1 in talent to number 2 overall and number 1 in talent, Oregon probably improved from 2024 to 2025. Texas did a very bad job reloading. Pretty much everything got worse compared to the prior year. Georgia was kind of in between, I would say, the Oregon and Ohio State at the top, and Texas. Georgia didn't use the portal that much. They did some at receiver. They hit there, and they were the youngest out of all 4 of those, I think, or at least as young as Oregon. And they kicked Texas's rear. They won the SEC for the 2nd year in a row, and now they're going to be top 10 in returning production while not using the portal that much, because they're bringing that much volume and that many talented players back to Athens for what should be their best team this fall since that 2023 team that was 4 points removed from a college football playoff appearance. Kirby Smart, what makes him fantastic is the game management and just his ability to feel the right play, the right strategy at the right time. Their game against Ole Miss last year, round 2, is actually a good example of this, where Georgia's down 4th quarter to Ole Miss, and Gunnar Stockton and the offense are still out in the field, and they are clapping, like Gunnar Stockton is clapping to get Ole Miss off sides. Like, I don't think they're going to actually go for it there. And then the center accidentally snaps it. Georgia has no idea what's going on, because they were just trying to get off sides and see if they could get closer to the first down. If they could, they'd then probably go for it. If not, they would punt. And you just give Ole Miss an easy field position to score in what was a very close back and forth game. Well, that ends up pretty much losing them the game, as after that play, Georgia goes up to tie it. If not for that play, Georgia probably ends up winning it, but then instead Ole Miss wins, and they have an incredible story entering Pete Golding's first full year. It was a bad loss. Same with the Notre Dame postseason loss. But those losses were pretty close. They were. I mean, Notre Dame, if not for a strip sack that resulted in a passing touchdown and a kickoff return for a touchdown, Georgia could have won. It's just, football's a game of close margins, and they happen to lose games of close margins in the quarterfinals coming off of the bye. They had fantastic regular seasons otherwise. Fantastic. They really did. So I don't get the Kirby Smart hate that I've been recently saying or seeing, where some people are saying he's washed in especially the Big Ten. Nationally, people are dropping him behind Ryan Day. And I understand why. But I also think, based on what I've seen from those two, you shouldn't drop Smart behind Ryan Day after this year. If you were going to drop him, you should have dropped him after 2024, when the difference between those teams in terms of both achievement and talent was clearly very vast. Because last year the difference in talent was vast, but they basically achieved the same thing. I can actually argue last year Georgia achieved more because they played a tougher schedule and won the same amount of games. Like, Ohio State lost to Miami and Indiana, who played for the national title game. And yes, Georgia didn't lose to as impressive teams, but Ole Miss was there with Miami. Alabama at the beginning of the year was better than they were at the end of the year. And they won 12 games and won their conference. So I think that this idea that Kirby Smart is falling off is the same type of energy that people felt against Ryan Day entering 2024, where they said he can't win the big one, despite always beating top 10 Penn State teams, beating some great Notre Dame teams, and competing with a Michigan team that went 15-0 the prior year. Kirby Smart's still an elite coach. He still has his fastball. He might be the best game manager in all of college football. So just cool off with some of the hate and realize that Georgia's going to be a top 5 team probably this coming fall. Now let's talk about Curt Cignetti. And this will be the last one for the coaches. Then we will briefly discuss a lot of things for some of these following videos. Okay, Curt Cignetti. Curt Cignetti is going to win another national title, at least one more, if not more than that. I'm confident in saying this because of what Curt Cignetti believes in, being fast, physical, and relentless, and how this team executes and follows those precepts. And also because he's 27-2 at Indiana. Freaking Indiana with a Big Ten title and national title. And that's phenomenal. That's unheard of. That is unthinkable before Curt Cignetti got there. So to dive a little bit deeper into that, look at the 5-year program trend of Indiana. I bring this up in almost all of my videos because it paints a picture of what Indiana has become. Where 2024, 11-2, they reached the playoffs. They were probably a top 15 team that year, which is amazing anyway by Indiana standards. The year after that, they're 16-0. They're the best team that year. And they're excellent. They were the most efficient team. They had the best record. They had the best strength of record. They had the best staff. It's incredible what they did. And you can't talk about it enough. There are people who will get exhausted about me praising Indiana and their staff. There are people already telling me that, I'm drastically overrating their staff. Guys, your favorite coach, unless he's Curt Cignetti, couldn't have won a title in Indiana. It just, historically, the odds of that happening are so low that you can effectively say they couldn't have done that. Not for sure, but pretending that other top coaches who mostly do things very differently from Cignetti, they try to recruit at a high level, and Cignetti does too, but they're at either Georgia or Ohio State or Alabama or Oregon where you naturally recruit way better players than Indiana just at a baseline because your program standard is better and previously you've had far much more money to work with. Some of those programs still have a lot more money to work with than Indiana does. And yet, they were able to put together a conglomerate of basically rejects from different states and different places across the country. Players that Ohio State or Georgia never really thought to recruit until maybe they got in the portal. And anyway, they didn't prioritize them there. Then, like, Fernando Mendoza almost going to Georgia is my favorite story. It's absolutely my favorite story, where if he goes to Georgia, he's probably better than Stockton. Maybe they don't win it all, but they probably win an additional game, and they probably beat Ole Miss in the postseason. Just because that's how good Mendoza was, even though Stockton was also a great quarterback, but not as good. Or the idea that, like, Ohio State has had recent issues on the O-line, but they still, even with like a dramatic drop-off in recruiting there until the past cycle, had a way more talented blue chip O-line than Indiana, and Indiana goes out and just fields a better O-line. Or even defensively, in efficiency, Indiana had a more efficient defense than Ohio State, and Ohio State had like 5, maybe because someone, a freshman or sophomore on their defense is a future first rounder. They could have like 6, 7, or 8 future first rounders on that defense. And most of them played, and a lot of them are leaving after this year. Indiana probably has 1, maybe 2 at the best from what we know of, or maybe more than that, but not nearly as much as Ohio State. And efficiency-wise, they were better there. That is something special, and that's something you should jump right on and not throw all your methodology out the window, but you have to adapt to it. You can't just say, oh, well, it's a one-off, because that's what people said last year. And Curt Cignetti, his foundations and his methods and what he wants to do and why he was able to build a team that, look, just is this good. First in yards per point margin, first in all the consensus power ratings, 4th in success rate margin, really first in points per play margin. Notre Dame was ahead of them, but only because they played a cupcake schedule. And 6th in EPA per play margin, and that's partially weighed down by the top 10 schedule Indiana played when it was all said and done. Those things have not changed. The methods to the madness, to the genius, why he's able to do what he's been doing. I mean, I don't know if you guys agree with this or not, but it feels like Indiana very quickly is going to become hated nationally. And you saw this some last year, where people like, I think Alabama, Miami were the most guilty of this. Ohio State was less guilty, but in the preseason, it feels like they're more guilty. Where those fan bases, seeing on social media, either tried to act like Indiana was the fluke that they would essentially like crap on, like they'd just pull down their pants and like force Indiana to be their toilet, and they'd handily beat them and then just move on with it and kind of end what Indiana was doing. Or they acted like, after the fact, their loss was totally a fluke and it will never happen again. They can't get out of their head that Indiana's logo essentially means nothing, but also the fact that their logo doesn't really mean that much anymore. I said this in talking about Ryan Day and a little bit about Kirby Smart, but more so Day, because Ohio State is historically a blue blood. Georgia's not. They're close to that, but not quite. Ohio State's greatness does in part relate to their program, but what some of their fans misunderstand is that Day is also the core of their greatness too. Like, Day's just a phenomenal coach. Other blue bloods that have great backgrounds, not quite as great as Ohio State, but have great backgrounds, and then mess up coaching hires, completely fall apart. Ohio State just hasn't messed up a full-time coaching hire in eons, if not in the entire history of their program, have they like not really badly messed up a coaching hire. Indiana, for example, it's a program, is one of the worst programs of all time because they've messed up coaching hire after coaching hire, and then those systemic issues that the athletic department and the coaching hires created caused Indiana to become this place where no one wanted to coach because of all the things they'd have to face, and Indiana got comfortable being bad. Well, that's no longer the case anymore. It doesn't matter that they have the second most losingest program of all time. They're a top 5 program right now. Like, seriously, they are. And something that I like, and someone in the comments is bringing this up right now, Oregon fans, for example, truly appreciated Indiana's rise, and they got along well. And the reason Oregon and Indiana get along well is that Miami, Georgia, and Ohio State are much more established brands than Indiana. And while Oregon currently is thought of as an established brand, Oregon fans have never really felt like they are. They've always felt like they're a new power that no one takes seriously, and they want to be taken seriously. So for them to see Indiana, even though it was demoralizing for Oregon fans to see Indiana do it before them, it was also kind of heartwarming to see, yes, a unknown program took down the established powers, made them angry, outdid everything they did, and now we return everyone next year. Like, why can't we do that too? Not to go on a long ramble, but the point I'm trying to make is most people that try to downplay Indiana's success last year or their staff, a lot of it has more so to do with jealousy or anger at their own team for not living up to the same potential that Indiana lived up to. Because, and this shouldn't make Indiana fans mad, but a lot of teams last year had rosters that if Cignetti's staff commanded that roster, they would have been better than Indiana. They would have been. I think Ohio State, Oregon, Miami, Georgia are like Notre Dame. A lot of those teams that finished top 5 or even top 10 in metrics last year are classic examples of this, where if Cignetti coached every team that finished in the top 10 of FPI last year, Indiana probably finishes among the lower end of those teams. He's just that good of a coach. He's that good, where he was able to compensate for severe roster deficits by developing his players at a level that no other staff did, or you could even argue was capable of. And he was able to create the ideal culture, the ideal roster, the correct level of balance, call the correct plays, game plan the correct way. And so much went in Indiana's way that some will argue it's luck. But what I will remind you of, to go back, is that for Indiana, with the 72nd best recruiting roster, to have a defense as good as the one that you see on the left-hand side of your screen, or an offense or a special teams to be that good with that talent, that's statistically improbable. That isn't just luck going Indiana's way in some regards. And in some regards, it probably did. They didn't suffer that many injuries despite being a very thin team. But luck does not explain a large part of it. I can also, if I wanted to, and I'm not going to, like when I say that about Indiana, it's not taking away from their title. I don't really even care about that. Like, oh, they didn't suffer many injuries. Well, that probably has more so to do with their strength and conditioning staff and preparation being better than yours than luck. Like, seriously. It's the same with Ohio State last year, or 2 years ago now. Ohio State in 2024, you could argue, was lucky that conveniently, the year they finally lose 2 regular season games, the 12-team playoff is introduced, so they thankfully get in. It was also very convenient that no team in the postseason had a Michigan-level D-line to put them in their offense in a complete blender again. Because most years you have like more teams at the top that have that level of D-line. Michigan the year before that, I could argue, benefited from never playing a true top 5 team neutral field. And for them not getting like kicked out of college football when Stallion stuff broke. Because if that happened 10 years before, their season probably ends as the NCAA was much more powerful. And then we could go on and on for most national champions outside of some of the greatest teams of all time that were just so good that you can't even argue the luck point. But I don't even think there is an argument with luck. Because there are so many different teams and teams with so many different gifts and abilities. Just utilize what you have and it will come to you to a certain degree. And that's what Indiana did more than anyone else, because they didn't have a freak of nature on their roster like Jeremiah Smith or Arvell Reese or Caleb Downs. They didn't. They didn't have a defensive lineman with the talent of Cade McDonald or Mateo Uyunglele or Amari Washington or Bear Alexander. They didn't have a offensive lineman with the talent of Andrew Sprague. They didn't have a corner. Well, they had D'Angelo Pons, who's a freak. That's not a good example. They didn't have a tight end as talented as Oscar Delp or a tight end as talented as Max Clare or Jack Endries. And yet Nowakowski was a better blocker than all of them and did a really good job. The Hoosiers can do all of this again because they were able to maximize talent and put together an elite staff. And I say this in most videos I talk about Indiana because we have yet to process how crazy this is. It's so crazy that it can't be lucky. It can't be. Luck does not explain how crazy this is. This is something that is real. It's something that I'm not giving up on. It is something that, look, if I'm totally wrong, I'm going to defend it. I'm absolutely going to defend it, even if I'm wrong. And Cignetti say never wins a title or somehow goes down after this. And I don't think that'll happen. This is so insane that Indiana with that talent composite could win it all. And not just win it all, dominate Oregon twice, dominate Alabama, beat Miami while their receivers were dropping footballs and while their defense wasn't tackling well. And the fact that they were able to, on a neutral field, even play with that Ohio State team. Now that we've seen that Ohio State team at the NFL Combine, and we know that Day's a top 3 coach who has an argument to be number 1. That's insane. That's crazy. So that's why Cignetti will win another title. He will win another title because he's already done it with the 72nd best roster according to recruiting services. And he's been able to maintain his staff and build a culture where if he loses coaches, he's just going to bring good coaches in again. He has that ecosystem. We've seen it before with Corey Heatherman. Corey Heatherman leaves, Bryant Haynes comes in. I imagine after Derek Owings leaves, the new strength and conditioning coach is going to be just as good. He's doing this at Indiana. And this has just begun. And they tackle perfectly. They don't miss tackles. They don't commit penalties. They don't get overly emotional. They just do their job, work hard. They put in more effort than you. And they're as strong or stronger than you are. That's what Indiana football is. And the beauty of all of those things is those are all foundational. And because they're all foundational, all key to being successful, everyone can do them. Everyone can. Not everyone can have Arvell Reese, Caleb Downs, or Jeremiah Smith on their roster. Not everyone can have Dante Moore, DeCorian Moore, Nasir Wyatt, Brandon Finney on their roster. Not everyone can have Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Will Johnson on their roster. But you can maximize those precepts I mentioned, and if you do that and win and compete financially, you can then recruit those players I talked about to your roster and get even better. And that is why Cignetti is going to win another national title, because they are only going to get better players, and they are only going to become more set in stone in their foundation. And this is a program that people want to go away because it makes it harder for teams at the top to consistently flex their muscles. But this is a top program moving forward. And their leader is going to win another and further cement Indiana as a top program in America. That I am confident in. Now we're getting to some other topics. These probably shouldn't take that long. We'll see. Never want to make any promises, but these are, safe to say, cracking my neck here, because some of them are pretty controversial. These are shorter topics about teams that I'm just, interested in, that I want to talk about. And some of them have to, that's a little bit of a sneak peek there. Some of them have to do with viewer questions. I'm probably in the future going to try to answer viewer questions with the original, person who asked that question's name. Didn't have the time to implement that before this stream and before some streams in the future, but probably after I'm done with school, we'll get that set up where we have some weekly questions that we answer for, say, 5 minutes or so. Let's talk about this and some other topics. Does Nebraska even have a path to the college football playoff? This schedule is brutal, and I know Matt Rule should be totally safe if he earns 6 wins because of that. However, a viewer asked me this question, so I want to lay out the insane scenario here. They would have to win all of their games except for Indiana, Oregon, and Ohio State, and get lucky with many other teams losing at least 3 or more games to get in. And the ultimate insane scenario would probably be them beating one of Oregon, Indiana, or Ohio State. Taking a look at this schedule for Nebraska yields kind of a pit that forms in my stomach here. Nebraska and Wisconsin, a few years ago, hired Luke Fickell and Matt Rule. On average, Rule has had the easier schedule, and recently much easier schedule than Fickell. And they've kind of been similar quality teams if you've watched them. Now, the schedule dynamic has flipped. And now, Nebraska has to deal with the uber tough schedule, and Wisconsin gets the easy pass. Rule couldn't, at Nebraska, take advantage of the easier schedules to maximize wins and, say, get a top 25 finish or flirt with the college football playoff. I don't know if Wisconsin's going to do that either. But one thing I know with Nebraska is they're going to have to improve in so many areas to account for Dylan Raiola transferring to Oregon and for their average caliber of opponent gaining probably a whole touchdown, if not more, in power ratings. The toughest team Nebraska played last year was Iowa or Penn State at the end of the year. Those were top 15, top 20 teams. Michigan was probably the next toughest, along with USC. USC was top 15 caliber, Michigan top 25 caliber. Nebraska here has 1, 2, 3 teams, Indiana, Oregon, Ohio State, who could be the 3 best teams in America, who I have as all top 5 teams. I also have Iowa and Washington as top 15 teams. And North Dakota is probably better than Houston Christian in the FCS. One of Ohio or Bowling Green probably have a good enough roster to make things interesting. And for Nebraska, like, look, last year they played Minnesota on the road. Minnesota last year is probably going to be a similar caliber of team to what Illinois or Rutgers will be this year. And they lost that game by 18 points. So for Nebraska, I ask again, answer in the comment section below. I'm looking at the second camera here. Is there a path? Is there? Because I don't really know if there is. I would like to say that there is, but I think it takes a lot of things. And if I were to go through quickly the list of things that it would take Jeep Wade transforming the offensive line into one of the best units, and particularly best run blocking units in the sport. It would take Nebraska reloading from the departure of Emmett Johnson. It would take Anthony Calandria at least not being turnover prone and being healthy for the entire year, using his legs in combination with the prior 2 things I brought up. It would take receiver improving. It would take defensively for the defensive line to take a massive step forward, and for the 4-2-5 to be ready to succeed and function at a good capacity at maybe 80% of what Rob Orich's defense could be with the talent provided in year 1. And it would probably take, too, teams on this schedule being a bit worse than I anticipate, and other teams around college football disappointing. So, for example, you probably, I'm not going to say at Oregon because it's on the road, and Oregon is the best roster on the schedule, but say Indiana takes a bigger step back than I expect, or Ohio State takes a bigger step back than I expect, and Iowa takes a bigger step back than I expect. Now it's a bit easier to envision them getting there. On top of that, say the SEC only has 1 team with 2 losses emerge, which is realistic because no SEC team has a win total higher than 9.5, and only 2 of them have a 9.5 win total. Say in the Big Ten, you don't really have any team that has 1 loss or is undefeated. You have a bunch of 2-loss teams. Maybe Oregon's the sole team with a single loss, and there's just chaos across the sport. Say one of Texas Tech or Notre Dame fold with high expectations in the same way that Clemson or Penn State did last year, or say Texas does that, or even Oregon, dare I say it, does that. Then there's a path for Nebraska. For Nebraska, though, I'm going to end this by telling you, if you're a fan, I know patience has been preached over and over and over again, and you hate it, but where you're at now is better than you were under Riley and under Frost. As long as Rule is competitive this year and they finish around their win total, so that's 5, 6, or 7 wins, as long as they're in that range, you got to give them 27 because they're going to have a good recruiting class coming in. They're probably going to be more aggressive in the portal then. This is still a fairly young team, so you'll have a lot of returning production entering that year. And the schedule, it's not going to be harder than this. It's not. I mean, getting Indiana, Oregon, and Ohio State, and then Iowa on the road, those 4 teams with where they're at in their cycles, in their history, that is one of the toughest schedules in America. So I would preach patience, don't know why I butchered that there. But then again, for Nebraska, as long as they don't butcher this schedule, as long as they don't butcher the roster, Rule should stick around. As for the path to the playoffs that Nebraska has, it would take so much that I would say it's improbable, if not impossible. But I said earlier, as long as the lines of scrimmage dramatically improve, Calandria is not turnover prone, and the 4-2-5 defense is running at 80 or 90% capacity where you're not having busted coverages, the tackling is good, the fundamental soundness is perfect, and the special teams doesn't drop off with Mike Eckler's departure, that, along with more chaos across the sport, would be the path. Let's talk about Washington and just discussing their team, because I strongly believe Washington will be a good team this year. The Washington Huskies are among the few vying for the college football playoff this fall. They return a dynamic quarterback in DeMond Williams, and more importantly, their defense enters year 2 of a fantastic system. I strongly believe the Washington Huskies are set up to compete for the college football playoff this fall under Jedd Fisch, who's a very underrated coach. Washington, over the past 5 years, it's still within striking distance of the Jimmy Lake era, has consistently improved in recruiting on average over the past 5 years. They still have an upward trend in looking at power rating, in looking at efficiency, and I would say coaching too. Jedd Fisch, I think, is a top 15 coach right now. Kalen DeBoer's a top 10 coach, if not a top 5 coach. Jimmy Lake, that entire era was just an utter disaster that I don't know if we should speak of beyond that. But the trend is clearly going up. They just signed their best recruiting class of the 2020s this past cycle. They went 9-4, their third best record over the past 5 years. And Ryan Walters is an elite DC. So I like what I'm seeing out of Washington right now on defense, and Fisch is a great offensive mind. When you look at the Huskies, they were 5th in success rate margin. And I didn't expect that. But what that tells you, especially when you watch what they do, they played Michigan, Oregon, and Ohio State very competitively, especially when you look at what successful plays were. The difference in those games, when it comes down to it, is really Washington turned over the football in those games and scored a few impressive plays and at least frustrated those teams for 2 or 3 quarters, really shutting down their offenses for much of the game. And what happened is, in the end, it just got away from them. They were very competitive analytically against those 3 teams. And their other loss was Wisconsin, who they probably should have beaten. And in their other 8 games, with rare exception, they dominated. They were a good team, for sure. And they were top 20 last year, I think. I mean, the only teams in the Big Ten at the end of the year that were definitively better, I would say Ohio State, Indiana, Oregon, and probably USC was slightly better, but not much better. Washington's offense wasn't as good. Their defense was much better. And I do think Washington, again, I know they lost to Wisconsin, but I think Washington was a slightly better team on the road given how they played Michigan. They were a good team, and they return a lot of players too. For example, DeMond Williams, who had a little over 3-to-1 TDI&T ratio, top 25 in QBR, good PFF grade, completed 69.5% of his passes, and had over 3,000 passing yards. DeMond Williams, entering this season, tried to transfer out, got blocked, returned to Washington. I don't think that's going to be a problem. I think in the business world, in the modern college football world, everyone understands business is business. So I think the staff and the roster, now that Williams apologized and is back to Washington, I don't think they're really going to care in the long term. I don't have concerns there. The only area I really have concern with Washington would honestly be the schedule. If they had a Texas Tech or Notre Dame caliber schedule, I would pick Washington to win 10 games right now. They could even win 11 with those schedules. With Texas Tech, I probably would pick them to win 11 because Texas Tech doesn't really play anybody. But when you have to play USC on the road, Iowa at home right after that, you have to play Nebraska on the road and Penn State at home right after that. Then in between Penn State and Indiana, you have to play at Michigan State, cross-country trip, and you have to play at Oregon at the end of the year. That is a tough schedule. It is not a forgiving schedule. You get your easier teams, minus Oregon and USC, on the road, and a lot of tough teams at home. No Big Ten game in this schedule is a guaranteed win. So that would be the only concerning part if I were a Washington fan, is the schedule and the fact you're just not quite a top 10 caliber team yet combined with that. But Washington, I think, has top 10 potential this year if everything breaks right. They have the talent, they have the coaching, they have the defensive scheme that worked very well at Illinois under Ryan Walters, and I think has worked well at Washington thus far. I strongly believe that Washington is a college football playoff caliber team this year, And I can't wait to see what Jed Fish, Ryan Walters, DeMond Williams, and that roster produce for the Huskies this fall. Can't wait. Let's talk about Michigan and how good the Wolverines are if Bryce Underwood is elite. If Underwood has a Heisman-worthy season and is, say, a top 5 quarterback in the country, that means Michigan is going to the college football playoff and winning a playoff game, 100%. They could also compete for winning the Big Ten or winning it all if he's that good. In 2025, he only completed about 60% of his passes, 11 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. He had a QBR that was fringe top 25. I don't believe currently that Underwood is going to become Cam Newton. And what I described to start off the video would not quite be Cam Newton, but would be close to that or Jaden Daniels, honestly. The good news for Underwood in Michigan is that he's only going to be entering his second year. And with a dramatic staff upgrade, better receivers, an overall roster upgrade, and another year in the program, I think that signs point to him being a much better player and quarterback this year than he was last year. A viewer asked me this question in my Discord server, so I wanted to answer it here, talking about what if Underwood plays to the potential that his high school rating indicated. If that happens, guys, and other things go Michigan's way, Michigan could win it all this year. If Underwood's a top 5 quarterback and Jay Hill fields a top 15 defense, which you would expect with the talent he has, what he did at BYU, and Jason Beck meshes with the other players on offense to create an offense that with Devin Dampier was top 10 or top 5, that type of offense with Underwood, a top 5 quarterback in Underwood, would be a top 5 offense and maybe the best offense in America. And at that point, you're talking about a team that could compete for winning it all and might even be the favorite depending on how other things pan out. That's the type of ceiling Michigan has. Now, I think picking all of those things to go Michigan's way is very premature, and that's why I'm not doing that. I think if Michigan is going to compete for a national title under Kyle Whittingham, it will be 2027 when the staff's in their second year, and most Michigan players will return that season, including Underwood, if things go well this year. And also, the schedule is going to be a bit lighter. They'll have to travel to Texas, but they get Ohio State at home. And if my memory serves me correctly, they only play one of Oregon or Indiana. They don't play both. Or maybe they do, but maybe they get Oregon and Ohio State at home and play Indiana on the road, which is more favorable than this year's current alignment. So schedule will be slightly easier. Roster should be better. Underwood could be in year 3. But we're talking about this year. Michigan, if Underwood is top 5, I will tell you will be favored in 10 of their 12 games. Probably. Maybe Indiana at home would be favored over them, but that would be pretty big because that'd be a 6-point swing from playing at Indiana. And if Underwood's that good, you're probably not seeing Michigan being a touchdown worse than Indiana. They're also not going to be a touchdown worse than Oregon or Ohio State. They could be better than even 1 or 2 or even if all of those teams, if that's the case. But with it being on the road at Ohio State and Oregon, they'd probably be underdogs. So the path for Michigan, if Underwood is that elite, is a path that is to the national title and certainly to the playoffs. If Underwood's a top 5 quarterback, it would take Oregon, Ohio State, and Indiana probably all being the same as last year or improving, and close losses in those games for Michigan to not make the playoff if he's that good. Because the rest of the roster is good enough and the staff's great enough where you pair that with a top 5 quarterback and they're not losing to Oklahoma. They're not losing to Iowa. They're not losing to anyone except for Indiana, Oregon, or Ohio State, if that's the case. Again, this is a hypothetical video. I'm not pretending or picking Underwood to be that good this year or right now. Not doing that. I myself probably think at the end of the year he'll be a top 10 quarterback, but top 5 is significantly better than top 10 most of the time. And I don't know if he'll start off the year that well. I want to hear some things in spring camp, do a bit more research. But if Underwood is that good, if he is truly an elite quarterback, and one of the top quarterbacks, maybe the top quarterback in the Big Ten or close to that nationally, you're talking about a team that can compete for winning it all and certainly reaches the college football playoff this fall. Good question. Now we'll get into some other topics here, and then we'll close out. Thank you guys again as we're nearing the end. Thank you for watching. Really appreciate it. After this, I'm going to release these videos. I'm going to cook up some smash burgers. I'm going to study for some just school assignments in my final semester at Michigan. You guys have made my life a blast, all of you. Whether my biggest fans, whether the people who are going back and forth in my comment section right now, even the people who don't like me and occasionally tune in or comment. All of you, just by engaging with me, have helped make me some money, have helped support my livelihood in some way, and just make this awesome. So I appreciate you all very much. Penn State needs to give Matt Campbell time. I see that Penn State's win total is at 9.5. I see a lot of hype and excitement from Penn State fans, and as I talked about with producer Jesse, you should be excited if you're a Penn State fan. You're going to get a new culture. James Franklin, I think last year, was totally exposed as a fraud, which he is, losing far more worse games or far more games against worse competition than what Penn State is, than beating teams at Penn State's level or above that. You should be excited. Better coaching, a complete change of the guard, an easy schedule. And Matt Campbell is the coach that Penn State needs. That is a good hire. But just like Penn State needed him in their hour of desperation, Campbell needs you as a Penn State fan, or you as a Penn State booster, in his hour of desperation. Because this roster situation for Penn State, I'm not going to, just dance around it. You can see for yourself. It is going to be a bit dire. Now, by dire, I don't mean, it's going to be Rich Rod, Michigan. No. By dire, I mean 7 or 8 wins, and that would be disappointing from a Penn State fan's perspective with this schedule and with what's on paper is being brought in, or at least on the surface. I think if you go a bit deeper, you realize that since most players from that 2021, 2022, 2023, and some even from the 2024 class are just gone now, they transferred or left for the NFL, you'll realize that Penn State's 62nd recruiting class, according to On3, is much closer to their current roster than the prior 4 classes combined are, with how much they lost and how much they're changing. This Penn State roster now is much closer to a Matt Campbell Ohio State roster than a James Franklin Penn State roster with Matt Campbell coaching. That is why he needs time. Penn State this year, they could go 11-1. They could even go 12-0 with that schedule. But I have a very hard time seeing them ever being a top 10 power-rated team this year. I think that is very close to impossible for them to be a top 10 power-rated team. If they are, then if you're Penn State, you might have a coach that'll win you your first natty in the 21st century. If this team is top 10 in power ratings, that means Campbell has the absolute goods of a head coach. That means you hired a guy that is close enough to Cignetti to where if you start recruiting at the level Franklin did again, well, I would expect you to win a national title if Campbell's there for a decade or longer, like Franklin was. It's going to be hard, though. And I think the alignment of the schedule, the win total, how Penn State was able to finish the year with some excitement, playing Indiana close, crushing Nebraska, and then beating Penn State in the bowl game, making that hire, the Pat Kraft audio leak. It's all snowballing into this insane level of momentum for Penn State, and that's happy. I was very disappointed by Penn State last year. Penn State fans more so. I was so high on them last year, and I feel like I haven't talked about them enough. So here I am telling you right now, long term, it's probably going to be a good fit. But you need to give him time. He does not have the players right now, certainly not, that Ohio State, Indiana, and Oregon do. He does not even have the players right now on the surface that Michigan does. And I would go a step further and say probably doesn't have the players that USC or Washington do. They probably right now have players like Iowa does. That's probably what Penn State has, is the equivalent of an Iowa roster. And not last year's Iowa roster, but like the average Kirk Ferentz roster. There are questions there. They have an Iowa State, Iowa level roster. If it pans out, if they stay healthy, if the right players are in the right positions, and if development and expectations and scheme are all maximized in year one, by expectations maximized, I mean the locker room, they play hard, they tune out the noise, they expect themselves to do well, and they play well, then that won't really matter with the schedule they have. Their talent won't limit them until the postseason, and just getting to the postseason will be a tremendous success. But it's not guaranteed to be that way. It's not. Matt Campbell has a 56.7 win percentage. Now, he will have a little bit more talent here than he did at Iowa State, but not enough to the point where you can't rule out year one possibly being rough, where Penn State is inconsistent and maybe they're better coached, but they just don't have the talent. Recently, he has had good seasons. They're 19-7 over the past 2 years, and that was even with some injuries. Now, they did play in a Big 12 that didn't have Texas and Oklahoma, but he's still at Iowa State, a program that's in debt, that is second in their own state to Iowa, that doesn't recruit all that well. And his process worked, producing NFL players at all levels, great college players. He's had some big wins. He has had more wins against the FPI top 10 in his career than James Franklin has. So I think he's certainly an upgrade over Franklin. The problem is you need to give him time, and you need to make sure he can bring in the same caliber of player Franklin could, and only then are you likely going to see a dramatic improvement from where Franklin was at Penn State. I think Matt Campbell's a top 15 coach in the sport right now, and he certainly has top 10 upside, and he can achieve that at Penn State, which is a school that is either a blue blood, or if you don't think they're a blue blood, they're very close to it. To take a look at the schedule again, guys, look at this. Marshall, Temple, Buffalo, Wisconsin, Northwestern, USC, Michigan, Purdue, Washington, Minnesota, Rutgers, Maryland. The win total should be 8.5 or 9.5. It should be. It should be that high. The only games where I see them as an underdog right now are at Michigan for sure. I think that's more than a touchdown underdog based on the roster. And I think they're a slight underdog at Washington and against USC, but very slight. I'm talking about less than 3 points. Washington might be more than 3. I think USC will be about 3 points. Outside of that, they're favored over everyone, and they're probably favored over Marshall, Temple, Buffalo, Wisconsin at home, Purdue at home, Rutgers at home, Minnesota at home, Maryland. They're probably favored over everyone except for Northwestern on the road by double digits. They might be favored over Northwestern on the road by double digits. So having a lot of games where you're a big favorite and your other games outside of Michigan, you're only a slight underdog to, yeah, that checks out to a 8.5 or more likely 9.5 win total. So I understand wanting to win big, and if you do, that should be viewed as gravy and a sign that you have the right guy. But give Matt Campbell time, because it's not guaranteed they're going to make the playoffs with the schedule. I don't even really think it's likely. There's just a lot changing on the roster, and the way Campbell has done things, I think, can indicate some time being taken for Penn State to reach the level even that Franklin had them at from 2022 to 2024. Okay, we'll talk about 2 more topics. Lane Kiffin and the NCAA being a collection of fools. So let's finish out with that. I believe that Lane Kiffin made the right move for Lane Kiffin, leaving Ole Miss to take the LSU job. You don't turn down Louisiana State University unless you're a coach at, say, 5 other programs where you have very unique circumstances. You can fill your pockets. You can win a national title because Les Miles, Nick Saban, and Ed Orgeron did it. My only pushback is that history suggests, not because of LSU, but because of Lane Kiffin, history suggests this won't work. So that's why I'm skeptical of Lane Kiffin long-term at LSU. Short-term, I think this team's a 9, maybe 10-win team, could even be an 11 or 12-win team. They're going to contend for the playoffs. They're going to be one of the 15 best teams in America. Their roster could, put them in the top 10 conversation. Kiffin has improved as a game day coach throughout his time at Ole Miss. And now he's bringing that to LSU along with the 4th ranked transfer portal class per On3. Where, look, LSU didn't bleed a ton of talent to the portal. They just lost a good amount to the NFL. And they brought in a gargantuan amount of top-end talent from all across the country to compete in Louisiana State, for Louisiana State. For LSU, they're bringing in 40 players, 33 are going out, and almost all of those 40 are better than almost all of those 33, with maybe a few exceptions here or there. The only classes that I personally would say are better than LSU's would be Indiana and maybe Texas Tech. Those are pretty much the only ones where I have at that level. And maybe Texas too. Texas lost a lot more talented players than LSU to the portal. LSU lost a good amount of backups or players that didn't do all that much. Texas also brought in more studs than LSU did, though. So Indiana, Texas Tech, Texas, and LSU, and maybe A&M, that would probably be my top 5. I'm probably higher on Texas than on 3 is just because of how many studs I think they brought in. But they did lose players like DeAndre Moore Jr. and Parker Livingston, who were talented, to other schools, for example. So LSU, talent-wise, they just check the box. And as long as you're competent at your job, which Brian Kelly wasn't at recruiting until the past 2 cycles when it was too late. If you're competent at your job at Louisiana State, you will always have talent. And I say Louisiana State because I just want to emphasize, the importance and the name of that university. I don't view it as a blue blood historically. Most people don't, but I would view it probably as a modern 21st century blue blood, where you should expect to do big things at LSU. You should expect to win titles. You should expect to compete for them. You bring in Sam Leavitt, too, who was injured last year. These 2025 stats don't really do him justice, but when healthy, he beat Texas Tech's defense. He held his own against them, and that is an argument to be the best defense in the country last year. Under the teaching and mentorship of Lane Kiffin, who was a quarterback guru, I can easily see him being a top 10 or even top 5 quarterback in the sport this year, if he's healthy and if their pairing is as good as it can be, if it lives up to its potential. When you look at the schedule of LSU too, it also aligns. Clemson is a dump. They're dead. Dabo Swinney's one of the worst Power 4 coaches right now in America. Louisiana Tech, that is a win. Ole Miss on the road will be tough, but they're not definitively better than you are. I'd actually say you have a better team than Ole Miss does. So that could be a win, could be a loss. Let's say it's a half a win. It's a 50-50 game. Texas A&M at home. You should win that. That early with how much A&M loses and it's at home and just the revenge factor, you should beat A&M. McNeese is a win. At Kentucky is a win. Mississippi State at home is a win. Auburn on the road should be a win. Entering the bye, you will be undefeated at 8-0 or you will be 7-1. Alabama at home, let's say that's a 50-50 game due to talent. Texas, that's probably a loss. Yeah, let's chalk that up as a loss since we made A&M and at Auburn not guaranteed wins, but closer to guaranteed wins than toss-ups. At Tennessee, 50-50 game. And then you got at Arkansas, that should be a win. So we have 1 loss and 3 toss-up games. That is a 9.5 win total right there. And probably you'd favor that to go over the over than the under, depending on how you look at LSU. I think that LSU is going to go 9-3 or 10-2. And that puts their odds of reaching the college football playoff at a pretty high level. And with Charlie Weiss Jr. as the OC, Blake Baker as the DC, they have a great staff. They have great players everywhere. We're not talking about this year, though. I'm talking about this year in the sense that, look, things are great for LSU. If they go 9-3 and barely miss, it'll be frustrating, but they'll say, hey, We have a better team than any of Kelly's teams outside of maybe that year where Jaden Daniels was an absolute freak. This is year one. We have momentum. My skepticism is about who Lane Kiffin is and how at Ole Miss he was 55-19, winning 74.3% of his games, and that's awesome. But the past 2 years he benefited from a very easy schedule. Very, very easy schedule. And while he did beat Kirby Smart once, that was with his best team, a team that was better than Georgia, more talented in the two deep than Georgia at the end of the year. And that same year he missed the playoffs. Why? Because he lost to Billy Napier, Mark Stoops, and Brian Kelly, all of whom are currently collecting unemployment checks. Not a good showing. Last year, he loses to Smart in a close game, beats Oklahoma and Florida in close games, and LSU in a close game. Outside of, honestly, the loss to Georgia was their most impressive performance of the year, because they didn't really play anyone last year either. And then their most impressive win in technically his era with his players was when he wasn't the coach. It was, Pete Golding beating, it was him beating Georgia in 2024, but the second most impressive was Pete Golding with his players beating Georgia in the postseason. So the point I'm trying to make is that he is a good coach, for sure. He's probably great even before that. But he never made the playoff at Ole Miss. Like, technically last year he did, but he left. So I'm not counting, I'm not accrediting him Tulane and Georgia as wins or Miami as a loss, especially given the chaos that was happening on that roster that he played a part in, which is understandable. He wants his players and coaches to get over there as quickly as possible. He had 0 CFP wins, 0 SEC titles. He did a great job building them up, but there were several circumstances that contributed to that. I think at LSU, he's going to win a similar percentage of his games, probably a little bit more than that. But the big question that you have to answer if he's going to succeed at LSU is, will he win a title or not? That is what will determine his success at LSU. Because LSU in the modern era, look, they have, and understandably so, Ohio State, Georgia, Alabama level expectations. Where if you do not win a natty there, your tenure's not a success. And that's the case with most blue blood schools. If you leave there without a natty, with rare exceptions, you do not have a successful tenure. And that's my skepticism with Lane Kiffin. I do not think he will leave LSU with a national title. I don't. The talent acquisition, good. He does a good job of scouting, but he is stubborn. He's a lot like Lincoln Riley, and more like Lincoln Riley than a lot of people realize. And the difference is, in my opinion, at least, well, you know what? I'm going to clip the video earlier because I don't know if there is a difference. I think this year will be a part of a referendum on that. But let's close out this segment. Let's close that out. Oh shoot, I forgot to show the cool graphic for LSU. I forgot to do that. I forgot it. Oh well, I'll use that for a different graphic because eventually there will be I'll probably make another video this summer further explaining my skepticism, and I can use it then. Last but not least, let's talk about the NCAA being a bunch of idiots. I can't describe how useless and pathetic the NCAA is. We have them trying to take away Indiana's title and selectively enforce tampering when, I'm just going to say it even though I'm a Michigan fan, Michigan was on-field cheating 2 years ago. Their title was not taken away, and their coach was simply suspended in season while being able to coach the team in practice. Nothing happened to Michigan. Nothing has happened to other teams that have tampered. Ole Miss, Ohio State, Oregon, Literally every team has tampered. Every team. I shout those out as examples of either bigger schools that spend a lot and say they speak out against tampering. I think Georgia, Ohio State, and Oregon have all spoken out against tampering while totally being involved in it. Like Georgia probably tampered for Josh McCray because of how weird that transfer was. Ohio State probably tampered for like Max Clare or for Quinshon Judkins or other top players they've had. Oregon has probably tampered for Coy Parrish, for example. Like, I'm not accusing them of actually doing anything all that wrong because they're trying to punish tampering when tampering is legal. There's nothing illegal about tampering. And the reason there's nothing illegal about tampering is they're not punishing anyone for doing it despite totally having evidence for it. Like, there is totally evidence that the NCAA has or that is out there for actual egregious tampering. There totally is. Like, Dabo Swinney was making a whole display about how, oh, I have evidence. And, you know, Dabo Swinney and Clemson are probably the one program that's stupid enough not to tamper. They actually think if they do it, like the fist of God is going to smite their program if they tamper, which won't happen. And nothing's happened. Like, nothing has come of that at all. It was a publicity stunt by Swinney to distract from the fact that he's a horrible coach right now. Like, he's awful at his job. That's what it was. And you know why nothing's happened? Because it's fake. There is no punishment for tampering. Tampering is not illegal. Tampering being illegal, same with going over the like $25 million limit for your roster, is the equivalent of there being a law technically on the books that is canceled out by another law that has been passed. It exists, but it doesn't mean anything. It's just there in word only. There's no enforcement. No one takes it seriously. It's only real as kind of a historical artifact. It's a fossilized law that doesn't have any life to it. That is why the NCAA is insane. And that is why this whole thing, which I know is weeks old, but if they mention it then, it's in the works now. And I want to talk about it now that it's a little bit quieter. It's so insane. It's so crazy. Like Lewis Moore. Okay, so maybe he was there for an additional year. Well, you had the injunction mid-season that allowed him to play. Is he just supposed to sit out after granted that injunction? Like after, you know, being granted that, you know, temporary release? Is he just supposed to sit out then? It's so stupid. Especially when we're seeing Mohamed Touré get an 8th year of eligibility. We're seeing Trinidad Chambliss get an additional year of eligibility. Diego Pavia got an additional year of eligibility. What's so different? What's so different here? And the whole, you know, there were people ironically joking like, oh, well, you know, Indiana and Michigan, like, well, both cheated, I guess, like, Ohio State and Georgia are like the only good programs. It's like, guys, shut up. They're only doing this because it's Indiana. This is only a threat because it's Indiana, and they think Indiana is still a small-time program. And it's not. Indiana right now is closer to Ohio State or Georgia than Michigan is to Indiana, like in the current here and now. That may sound insane, and it would be insane if maybe Indiana had this tiny endowment and a tiny donor base and a tiny alumni base, but they don't. They have the alumni and donor base and endowment of these larger Big Ten schools. They just haven't been big into athletics until very recently. They've been a sleeping giant that's woken up, and we've seen this before in college football history. It just wasn't the case for a long time. But Indiana is this new program that's woken up and will probably be here for the near and very long-term future. So I just think this is stupid, and I also don't think anything will come of it. I think this is an empty calorie threat. If they try to vacate it, it'll be challenged in court, and it will lose. And yeah, Indiana's national title isn't under any threat. The only thing that threatens Indiana, besides themselves, because their coach and their system and way of doing things is so great, are other top-end programs probably trying to punish them or supporting something like this so that competition is thinner at the top and those programs get to, be unbothered. But even I don't really think that's happening, because there's no benefit to even Ohio State to have the old way of doing things come back. If the old way of doing things comes back, it would benefit Ohio State from a Big Ten perspective, but it would kill them from a national perspective. They have benefited from the floodgates of Southern talent opening up due to NIL and the portal as much as anyone north of the Mason-Dixon line has, even though it's hurt them in some other areas. And that's the same thing with Michigan. It's the same thing with USC. Like, sure, maybe this new era has hurt some of your traditional blue bloods, regardless of where they are, but the non-SEC blue bloods really break even or still benefit. And probably the same with Texas, too, because of their financial situation. The other SEC blue bloods, yes, it absolutely hurts them. So for Indiana, I went off on a little bit of a tangent there. The NCAA is just insane. Like, you're not enforcing tampering. You're not punishing anyone for anything that they do wrong, because there are no rules in college football. There's no enforcement. The only reason it's not worse than it is right now is these coaches are mostly good people and they have respect for each other. That's pretty much it right there. Their own morality and conscience is the only enforcement we have, and the market naturally trying to regulate at some level, even though that has its limitations too. Those are the only things holding college football back. There is no enforcement arm. There is no punishment. You've even seen it with the College Football Playoff Committee. I bet you the Big Ten and SEC would love to push through strength of schedule requirements, and they could do that if there were actual rules, because they're much more powerful than the ACC and the Big 12. But they can't do a damn thing, because there is no chain of command in college football right now. It is the wild, wild west. That's it. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. Make sure to like, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment your thoughts down below. Longer show than I wanted it to be, but we got like 16 videos done. So the most videos I've done in a 3-hour, 40-minute span. Promise that Wednesday and Friday will be shorter. I can promise that it'll be 2.5 hours at the most. We will see you then, Wednesday and Friday at noon Eastern time. And as for right now, God bless and have a good day.